If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. In the spirit of Spooktober, what's the scariest, spookiest, or most terrifying creature or thing you've encountered in the deep woods or forests that made you not want to go back? I live in a village surrounded by a small forest of slender trees. Around the age of 12, a close friend and I were frolicking in the field by a small forest. We simply strolled around and interacted with the sticks we discovered, either hitting them against rocks or trees. We approached the forest we had been in countless times. Being there was not out of the ordinary for us. We discussed various topics and casually bumped into every tree we passed as usual, until both of us halted simultaneously. There was an object ahead of us, approximately 10 to 15 meters away. I was surprised but not frightened. Initially, I mistook it for a boar due to its pig-like nose. However, upon closer examination, its body resembled that of a German shepherd. However, if that wasn't strange already, it proceeded to move behind a slender tree as mentioned previously and simply vanished. It hadn't gone so far behind the tree that it was out of sight from where I was standing. It simply strolled behind the tree and never emerged on the opposite side. After observing it for about 10 seconds, I asked my friend, "Did you catch that?" Another 5 seconds went by with no response from him. I looked back and witnessed him running as he had never run before. I became anxious and began to flee from the forest. We reached the field and looked back, but it was still nowhere in sight. Still unaware of what it was. If it had been an animal, it likely would have fled due to the loud noises we produced earlier. I continue to reside at the same place but have never come across this thing again. Occasionally, I listen to peculiar sounds coming from the forest and the field during the late night hours. The following is a story that took place quite a few years ago, however, it still baffles me completely, and I'd like to share it here. As a teenager who has been in Boy Scouts for nearly my entire life, I truly enjoy exploring with my friends and gaining more trust as I mature. A few years ago, we, along with two girls named Amy and Harriet, ventured into the woods surrounding our campsite in search of a long, straight stick suitable for carving into a point. Bear in mind that I was a lot younger back then. Harriet was older, and Amy was only 1 year older than myself. We purposefully walked in the same direction to avoid getting lost and to memorize our surroundings so we could easily find our way back. After about 15 minutes, we were unable to find anything to return to, so we decided to turn around and head back to the campsite. That's what set off the initial panic. The trees had almost unnaturally knitted themselves together in such a way that it seemed our path was non-existent in the first place. Like it had just vanished. We scanned our surroundings in all directions, but to our surprise, everything appeared identical. Trees we could have sworn were different from one another appeared as all copies of the same tree. We kept walking in what we thought to be the correct direction, whilst shouting out for help, and eventually came to a concrete path, almost like a road, but very thin, separating the forest, splitting it in two. We didn't follow the road as it went in the wrong direction to our campsite. On the other side of the path, there was more forest, however, nearby was an abandoned shack that was likely used for storage or some other purpose. Never knowing what was in these woods, we kept walking. We eventually came to a road we didn't recognize. A woman wearing a pink and purple regatta outdoors coat walked past, and we frantically asked her for the direction of our campsite, as by now, according to our watches and Harriet's phone, we'd been walking for an hour and a half. She said she'd never seen us before, but there's another campsite in that direction. We followed her advice and eventually came back to our campsite. We frantically apologized for being so long and unable to find anything. The leader, Ian, noticed that all three of us were shaken up, and he stated with confusion that we had only been gone for 25 minutes, and our free time was still ongoing. To this day this baffles all three of us, as our free time was 40 minutes long, and our watches and phones had said we'd been gone for hours. The forest we were lost in felt crushing and claustrophobic, like we had entered an area that the concept of time didn't apply to. I believe in the paranormal, however, this was so unlike anything I've heard or experienced before. It felt as if we had entered a time vortex, and the hours spent in the forest felt like mere minutes in the rest of the world. The feeling was very strange, and it stuck with me for the rest of the camp. Thanks for listening to my story. It's a weird one, but it's true. I once held a hunting lease in Middle Georgia. It was an abandoned hunting camp that hadn't been used in several years. I'm not superstitious at all, but this place was legitimately spooky. It was miles down an overgrown dirt road, completely surrounded by trees. It's probably the most secluded place I've ever been. I used to hunt there by myself a lot, and there was always this weird sense that I wasn't alone out there. There was a locked gate at the front of the property, but it was not uncommon for us to find the front door of the cabin open, even when the door was locked. That was pretty creepy, but that's not what this story is about. One evening, I was hunting in a small valley near a food plot we had planted along a creek that bordered the property. From the minute I sat down, I had a weird feeling. Like I wasn't in a safe place even though I was holding .308 with ballistic tipped rounds. I didn't feel like I was the top predator out there. I didn't see any deer while I was sitting on the stand, but the forest was abuzz with activity. Birds, squirrels, and other critters singing their normal evening symphony, and then all of a sudden, silence. Everything just stopped. It felt like everything in the woods was looking right at me. It was getting dark quickly anyway, and I was extremely creeped out, so I packed up my gear and started the walk back up to the cabin. About 100 yards away, I had this feeling that something was coming up behind me. I spun around and pointed my rifle back down the path towards the food plot, and that's when I saw it. There was something standing in the middle of the path. It wasn't a person, but it didn't look like a deer or anything I've seen before. There was hardly any light to make out any features, but it almost looked like some kind of bipedal deer or something. It was just standing there. Stare at me. I quickly returned to the cabin, packed up, and left. I let the lease expire. Never went back after that. I lived in southern New Hampshire in a home set in the middle of the woods on a small mountain. My oldest son came to visit for a weekend. We decided to watch a movie in the late afternoon after I put my two youngest down for a nap. We decided to watch the movie, The 13th Warrior. There is a section of the movie where a fog or mist starts to travel from the mountains into the village where supposed mystical bear men would attack the villagers. Just as the mist was encompassing the village, we noticed a fog coming out of the woods and starting to surround our home. Then the TV shut off. The electricity shut off. We went around shutting the windows to keep the fog out. We had never experienced this before or since. The fog came up to the windows. My husband called the neighbor above us, and there was no fog up there, and they never saw it coming our way. Our neighbor got in his truck and came down because he did not believe it was surrounding our house. He drove by and then went back to his home. He called my husband back and told him that the fog was only around our home. Our house was the only one without power. We were kind of freaked out. The fog stayed for about 15 to 20 minutes, and suddenly we saw the fog retreat slowly back into the woods, and suddenly the TV went on. We all jumped and laughed nervously. Needless to say, we waited until the next day to watch the movie. I was about 17 when this happened. I moved in with my father after living with my mom for most of my life. Behind his house is a trail in between our house and the neighbor's house. It's pretty unbeaten, but you can still find your way through it. At the end of the trail, there is a tiny pond. The first time I walked back there, I found it very charming, until I turned my head to see a small porcelain sculpture of a boy sitting on a log. The paint had faded from years of sitting there, the shirt was still slightly colored, but the thing about the painting that bothered me most was his eyes. They looked so blank. But the most important detail to the story are the hands, or the lack thereof. His hands were broken off and nowhere to be seen. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a forgotten decoration put there by the neighbor long before I arrived. The pond behind my house afterwards is where I would go and smoke weed while my dad was home. The sculpture never bothered me too much. That is, until the day I touched it whilst I was walking around the pond. I walked to the very back and further into the woods and found a small wooden decrepit shack. I wasn't about to waltz in there and get shanked by a weirdo, so I left it as is, but I got a really sinister feeling from the shack when I turned my back on it. When I was walking back, I had to slightly lean on the sculpture so as not to fall into the pond. When I say I've never felt something so sickening and evil, I mean it. I immediately let go and sat back in the small chair that I had set up and began to smoke, thinking I'm just being paranoid. Then, as I finished my bowl, I felt something tug on my hoodie lightly, so I jerked my head to see. Nothing there. I just brushed it off as a branch or something, so I took a deep breath, leaned back in my chair, and looked up at the stars, leaving my arm dangling down off the chair. Then I felt a small, cold hand wrap its fingers around my index finger. I nearly shit myself, jumped up, and sprinted back to my house, leaving all my paraphernalia at the pond. Keep in mind it's fingers around my index finger. I nearly shit myself, jumped up, and sprinted back to my house, leaving all my paraphernalia at the pond. Keep in mind it's about 9:10-ish, so I'm tripping over branches and vines until I found myself back on my back porch. From there, I could hear several twigs snapping and footsteps crunching pine straw heading back towards the pond. I haven't been back since, and I'm not planning on going back. Between that old shed and the small handle sculpture, that whole area gives off bad energy, which thankfully I don't think I brought into my house. So yeah. My husband and I are avid backpackers in Oregon. We go out all seasons, including in the winter and the snow. So we were maybe 3 miles into the Jefferson Wilderness near Three-Fingered Jack. This happened in 2023. We had only gone that far because the snow was sometimes up to our hips with snowshoes on, and there wasn't a trail to follow, so it was rough going for us, especially our 2 dogs. We set up camp and settled into the tent for the night. It was probably around about 11 p.m. when my husband stops me reading out loud. We read Lord of the Rings out vocal to each other when we camp, and says, tersely, "What was that?" I kind of laughed, thinking he was pulling my leg, but then I heard it. This hair-raising, chilling, vocalization. It sounded like a mix of a moan and a wail, if that makes sense. I was instantly disturbed. I was like, oh. That. I looked at our 2 big dogs that tend to be protective and bark, and they were just cowering and shaking. It kept calling, and then more people began answering. There were 3 total, as far as we could tell. I was like, "Welp. Good night. We aren't reading anymore. We are going to lie here quietly and hope whatever is out there doesn't get interested in us." And that's what we did. I fell into an uneasy sleep, but my husband couldn't sleep. He said they continued the sound for 3 hours, and then they stopped. Never did I find out what they were. I looked up vocalizations for every single animal I could think of, even things like wolverines and birds. Nothing sounded remotely right. I could kick myself for not recording it. It simply didn't occur to me. I have camped and been out in the Cascades my whole life, and I've never experienced anything like that. And I hope never to again. I went on a family vacation to the Great Smoky Mountains. I'm not sure the month, but it was in the spring. We had been there a few days exploring just everywhere. This is something we have done every year. But this year it turned out to be very different. It was the day before we were to leave and head back home. My dad decided we would all walk around the trails and streams. We were at Deep Creek Loop Trail. My dad had taken his fishing pole. Dad, Mom, my brother, and myself were walking by a stream. My brother and I kind of walked away from the stream a little ways off trail into the woods. I'm not sure how far we were from our parents. I do know I couldn't see them anymore. I don't remember if my brother or myself saw it first. From a side view, my first thought was an animal because of the movement in the trees. So being very quiet, we stepped to the side by a tree to hide and to be able to watch it. What I thought was an animal was indeed not. It heard us and turned toward us. What I saw was horrifying. It was bent over devouring a dead animal. Possibly a deer. It was tearing its guts out and eating itself. It had bloody hands, face, and chest. I saw enough to know it wasn't an animal. But dear God, it wasn't a man either. It had bloody flesh hanging from its mouth and hands. It had a large forehead that looked like it had knots. It was very hairy, but not as hairy as a bear or a Bigfoot, and between the blood and the skin looked dirty. It was a deformed man. We were so scared that my brother took off running first, then I followed. I turned for just a second to see if it was coming after us. As I was turning to run also, it took off running the other way. It didn't stand up totally straight, but I could tell it was male. By what I saw, it was at least 6 feet tall and may have been taller. Since he didn't stand up straight, it was hard to tell. He was pretty thick but still very skinny and deformed. What got me was how it looked like a human man and creature mix. I could also smell an odor that was like flesh and garbage. We ran back to my parents and told them. My dad at first thought we might have been trying to pull a prank on him. He played along and walked back to where we had come from. A minute later he came back and said to us, "We have to go now." His face was pale, like he had lost all his color. We did go to a ranger and tell him everything. He said he was going to call another ranger, and they would look into it. He thanked us as we drove off. That was our last visit there. I had nightmares for a while, but I never spoke about them to anyone. I'm still unsure of what we witnessed, but it appeared to be a hybrid of a man and a monster. Back in 2012-2011, I was 17 years old and was accompanied by my boyfriend, B, and his friend, J. It was like 2 a.m. and we were out in their friends' orange groves driving around in a truck because the guys wanted to help the pest problem, wild boars, so they had guns, etc. Well, this was like Orange Grove. 2 or 3 we were at the end of the night, and we saw some dark human figure running, but it was running ridiculously fast. We watched as it seamlessly jumped an over 8-foot ditch and kept running until it disappeared into the woods. Well, fast forward a few weeks later, and we are there at the same grove as the incident, doing more pest control, and the guys mentioned to the forest on the right they had seen some buildings with armed guards. Weird, I know. While I can't confirm, I never saw. The guys wanted to go show our buddy who was with us this time. I had this really bad gut feeling, so my boyfriend stayed behind in the truck with me while Jay and another friend went to go look. So I had never been down there, but as soon as the boys headed off, I told B I had a weird feeling something was down by like a creek and that they really shouldn't have gone. Well, not 5 minutes later, they come hauling ass back. Keep in mind these guys are big guys with guns, and Jay was running so fast he fell in front of the truck as they got back. They jumped into the truck and sped off before even telling us what happened, but it turns out down by the creek they heard a noise, and when they looked, they saw someone down by the creek, except all they really noticed were glowing eyes and a shadowy figure that just didn't feel right and shook them to their core. They said the way it kind of stood up and looked at them just wasn't right. Needless to say, the guys didn't go into too much detail, but we never went back to that grove. I live in upstate New York, in Shenango County, dude, so about the same time last year, we let our dogs out like usual, and only one of them came back, ended up finding the other one. I live in the middle of nowhere. Anyways, we get in our vehicle and go to look for our other dog. A little up the road in one of our fields, full of bushes and brush, I see something out the corner of my eye, so I focus on it. This thing was a light tan, very large pit bull body/fur, but its arms and legs were formed outwards like a human doing a push-up, both front and back legs, with human-like muscles. I couldn't make out a face. I saw it for a second as it walked backwards into the bushes, and that was it. Never seen it ever again. I tried looking up so many things and could never figure out what it was, but I've never seen anything like it. Now, about a month or so ago, the same dog went on an adventure super late, and it was a little dark for me to want to explore. Me and my boyfriend walked around our land with flashlights looking for her, she's black, and we started hearing a weird animal cry from across the road on our neighbor's property. I listened for a couple seconds trying to make out what it was, but again, I've never heard something like that, so I started to panic, thinking my dog was hurt. As I got closer to the sound, it got quieter, almost as if it wanted me to follow it, so I immediately ran back over to my boyfriend, and we just waited for her to come back, which she did. But again, I tried to listen to every strange sound ever recorded in NY and couldn't find anything. I also know what the animals localish sound like that makes weird sounds, and it wasn't any of those. A lot of people around have said they've heard strange sounds while walking in woods or trails but obviously never went to explore. What it could be? The family house that everyone forgot about was our now dead cousin's house. It was someplace on the countryside. The house was in the woods, like deep in the woods. It was like a good hour's drive to the house. So when my mom and dad were thinking, hey, let's go there, let's see what the house looks like. So my mom and dad, with me and my younger brother and other cousin, went to the old house in the woods. When we got there, we were thinking it was like a small wood house. Have you ever seen those like small mansions? My mom and dad saw a guy who was fixing the roof. It came out that our dead cousin had a guy who took care of the house. The guy was in his 60s when he saw our car coming down the road. He waved and went back to fixing the roof. When Dad parked the car, the guy on the roof got down and walked to the car. The caretaker said that he was an old friend of the cousin that now takes care of the house. My mom and dad asked some more questions about him and the house. When they stopped asking questions, my mom walked into the house with my younger brother, and me and my cousin went looking around the property while Dad was unpacking some bags from the car. The property was really big. The backyard had a pool that had a small waterfall and a small lake with some ducks. Okay, now to the real story. When Dad got all the bags out and into the house, the caretaker of the house showed us the bedrooms, and what I liked the most was the living room. It was full of old stuff, some deer heads on the wall with 2 bolt-action rifles under it, and there were a lot of books, even some comics. When it was getting late, my young brother and mom went to sleep. Now me, my dad, and my cousin are in the living room listening to the caretaker, who was talking about a story of how he and our dead cousin did a bunch of stupid things as kids. The night went on until the caretaker's phone started buzzing, and then a voice came out of the phone, motion detected. The caretaker said it was a deer and just started closing the curtains on all the windows and locked all the doors and windows. The caretaker said that sometime animals try to get into the house to eat the food in them. Me and my dad were thinking, yeah, that's normal, but my cousin was cautious. The caretaker said that we should go to sleep, so we did. It was late in the night when I heard faint tapping and scratching in the morning. I asked the caretaker about it, and he just stood there for 20 seconds and then said it was some branches. We were there for 10 days. Every day the taping got much stronger, and until it was banging all over the house. My dad and cousin were sitting in the living room on days 8 or 9. It was late in the night when we heard it, motion detected in the backyard. My dad peeped through the curtains and just jolted the backyard. My dad peeped through the curtains and just jolted back and said something was out there and ran to the wall with the rifles on it and took them both. He gave one to me and my cousin while he ran upstairs and got my mom and older brother. The caretaker came down the stairs with a plastic bag with 3 boxes of ammo, 2 for the rifle and 1 for shotgun shells. The caretaker had a shotgun. And then we heard the sound of breaking glass in the living room. The caretaker said, "Stay here," and then we heard, bang bang bang. Then the caretaker said, "Run to the car." Then my dad and mom, with my younger brother, ran through the front door, booking it to the car, and got in. The caretaker ran out as well, then we did, until we heard the demonic groaning behind us at the front door. My cousin turned around and shot 2 shots at whatever it was. The muzzle shots lit up the darkness for a second, and he saw it, a hairy thing crouched down, now peeking from the right side of the door. Me and my cousin got in the car with the caretaker last and got out of that place. In the morning, the caretaker told us that the property was cursed by the natives that lived on it. Then in the morning, my dad and I went back to get our clothes and whatnot and saw muddy footprints and dark blackish blood at the front door and the kitchen. We stuffed our car with our belongings and got out of there to never come back again. This happened a year ago. So me and my stepbrother felt like exploring the woods we were not allowed in. We went to the large but lovely pond and found the snapping turtle we named Bob. We left shortly, and we found a really nice spot, and we sat there talking about stuff. Shortly after, the woods went silent, big no bueno, no birds chirping, no nothing, but after the birds went quiet, we heard people talking like the voices of my cousins. We were confused because we never told them our plan. We attempted to leave the woods but got lost. We didn't really freak out because we could still hear the road, which was close. We followed the noises and got there. A few days after, we went back in, this time armed with knives, a combat/survival knife and a throwing knife. We went in, birds still chirping, something we liked. Until they went silent again. We crouched down, looking around until the faint growl of something was heard. It didn't sound like any animal around. Long story short, we ran the duck out of there. I used to never believe in evil spirits or entities until one year. I think about 2014 to 2015 on my Native American reservation, when suicides among the young were occurring a lot more than usual. I mean from 11 to 16, and by that time 16 to 17. The people were puzzled as to why this was occurring. A coming of the communities was happening, and for once, the church people and the Native American religion had the same explanation. A suicidal spirit. Back in 2016 I was 18 and coming back home for a last woohoo party with childhood friends before I left off to work full time. Me and 3 of my friends and older brother decided we would go behind the hills to drink. Now where the housing is, when you walk out of my childhood home, there is a big hill and a huge ridge that is looking back at the housing. Beautiful sight. My dad still lives there, rip mom. Anyway, we are walking back there on the dirt road, and we must have been about 4 to 6 miles back. We didn't care. We decided to go off trail and walk through the woods, and we came upon flat ground with trees. We were all adults, so we decided to venture as far as we could, as we said. What we came across was actually more surprising than anything ever. We were walking and bullshitting around until a friend stopped and said, "Look," and pointed ahead. All we had seen were nooses all over the place, hanging from trees everywhere, more like a welcome to commit. We looked everywhere, and that sobbed all of us up instantly because it was eerie and shocking at the same time. After minutes of arguing, we decided to cut everyone down and burn the ropes to ride the evil, as we called it. Till that day on that flat land where those trees were. We still don't know who, what, or why they were set up, but they were 4 to 6 miles from civilization for one. And 2, there is no reason for those to ever be set up like that in such a way at such a time that was dark for the reservation. We concluded it was a practical joke used for filming or something more sinister. In the wake of the suicides that were happening on the reservation, people would find nooses all over the place, in children's parks, in the woods, or in such unnatural places. So me and a couple of other friends went into the forest the other day. We live in Switzerland, and you definitely won't find any scary animals deep in the woods. I'm a huge fan of going really deep into the forest. Sometimes I'd stay for 2 nights with no contact with the outside world, and so was my other friend that went with us. We took 3 other female friends, so when it got dark, they wanted to go back. I'm proud to say I've been sober for 2 years now, but my friend was quite drunk that night, and so as I went to accompany the girls out of the forest, he wanted to stay and wait there for me. When I got back, around 40 minutes later, he wasn't there. Luckily, I know these woods well, so I went looking for him even though we both had no battery on our phones. I'm really experienced, so I don't get spooked easily. I was looking for him for about 20 minutes, and I was already pretty far away from the closest trail when I started looking for him. That's when I heard something, well, more like somebody somewhere in the dark. Of course, first I thought it was a doe, but as I proceeded to walk deeper in the forest looking for him, I started to hear it more often. When I first realized I could hear 2 feet instead of 4 hooves, I thought it's my friend trying to spook me. I was getting more convinced that it was my friend when it started following me. It felt like it was watching me from the dark. I heard it breathe and suddenly stop as it would be holding its breath. I also heard sniffing. I was getting more and more convinced that it was a person. Well, by that time I was getting more convinced that it was indeed my drunk fella trying to spook me. Anytime I ran into the dark in the direction I heard it, it ran away. At one point, I swear I heard it fall down, and it sounded like an adult man. Well, at that time I really thought it's my friend. That changed after I heard it fall down. That's when I started to think it may not be him. At that point, I decided I needed to get the hell out of there. It was following me the whole way back into civilization. When I got out of the forest, I tried to convince myself it was an animal or something. I found my friend at the train station. He waited there for me the whole time. As time passed and I looked back at it, I was getting more and more convinced that that was a person out there, and I wanted to know more. Like 3 days later, me and my friend, the one from that night, went back to the spot. We took our gear, and we were ready to spend a night there to find out whatever was out in the darkness. We went during the day, found something like a playground, a little shack, there was a car tire mounted as a swing, there was this net, the one kids climb, we found some pots at the shed, well, it was more like a shelter, there were animal bones all around. It would be quite normal if it weren't for the fact that it was located around an hour's walk from the nearest trail. There was nothing around. Switzerland is pretty famous for its rather untouched nature. It was straight wilderness. I'd whose idea it was, but we set up a camp at the shack in hopes of finding it there. But unfortunately, or maybe I should say fortunately, we didn't hear anything in the night. We went to explore the same spots I saw it at with flashlights, but we found nothing. Our flashlights were the reason we didn't find it, but it gives me the creeps until now. I camped there a couple of times after that but never heard it again. As I look back at it, I'm convinced it was a person, genuinely. I've been camping in the wilderness for quite a while now and had a few creepy encounters, but this one pretty much tops it. My personal theory is that it was simply somebody out there in the woods with me, watching me from the dark, maybe a junkie, I'm not so sure myself, but it's not really typical for animals to follow you around like that, well, at least not for the ones that are not some type of predator, and if they were, they wouldn't take such a long time to attack. Everything just looks like it was a person, and it wasn't really quiet. An animal would try to be quiet if it was watching me, and it would be much quieter than what I saw. I'd be happy for any similar stories or theories of what it could be I saw that night. This happened a couple months ago, after one of my work days. I remember this so well, because this creeped me out so very much in the moment, and it still does. I walked into the nearby forest not too far from my home, thinking I'd go for a nice little evening walk there to get my mind off of things. The sun was setting, but it wasn't too dark, though. I did have my phone with me for a flashlight if needed. I was walking down the path that I usually walk on. It goes through the entire forest, maybe 1.5 kilometers away. After about 5 to 10 minutes of walking, I notice a person standing underneath a tree. They were standing totally still, with a bicycle by their side. I recall that they were dressed in neon yellow and black sports clothing, without any lights. I stopped to look and observed that they weren't doing anything, they were just standing there staring at something, and then turned to stare at me as soon as they noticed me. I felt weird about the whole thing, so I went on to another trail, which would be the quickest exit out of the forest, speed walking the whole way. Then I heard footsteps and some aggressive ringing noise of a bicycle bell. I ran out of there as fast as I could and hid behind a big rock and some pine trees. I'd guess I'm a coward, but this really scared the soul out of me, so I don't care. I stayed there for a while, and once things quieted down, I quickly went home. Years ago, my now wife and I were enjoying an evening walk in a local nature preserve. It was after sunset, and we were walking and drinking a beer. The trail we were on followed a river, and at one point there was a bridge that crossed to a small shelter with a bench. As we passed the bridge, we noticed a man in a black hoodie watching us. As we got farther away from him and I looked back, I realized that he got up and was now following us. By this point, it was almost completely dark, with maybe a half moon. We weren't sure if he just happened to be going the same way or had other things in mind, but better to be safe than sorry. Fortunately, I know these trails really well, so we sped up and dove down a dark side path and waited a bit. Right after stopping, we hear this guy running towards us, crashing through brush and tree branches in the dark. We could hear him breathing heavily, looking for us. At this point, my wife has a pair of scissors from her purse out. All I could think to do was pick up a tree branch from the ground and hurl it into the darkness. He ran toward the noise the stick made, and we booked it the other way the hell out of there. I live around a load of woods and forests. And some strange things have happened to my friends around my small community. One time I was walking through the woods with a couple of people, and everything was normal. We'd been in those woods countless times, and nothing particularly strange happened. We decided to get some water and food, and one girl decided that she'd stay behind. We didn't question it since we didn't think anything would possibly happen. We were around 100 to 200 meters in, and it would take us some time to get out and to come back. We came back, and she was crying. Another girl asked what was wrong, and she replied, "Something said my name." I heard something say my name behind me, and when I turned around, nothing was there. That's not exactly what she said, but that's what I could at least somewhat recall what she probably said. I was not very alarmed by this, since a lot of people knew this girl in our community, and they went into the woods as well. We collectively decided to get the duck out of there. And today I was walking my dog at around 9 p.m. and I was walking back to my house, and the road I was on had the woods on its left and right, and I heard a voice that I instantly didn't recognize. Instinct kicked in, and I got the duck out of there. I ran faster than I've ever ducking run in my life. I got home and I was soaking wet from all the sweat on me. I don't think I'll ever walk around those woods at night ever again. This happened about 8 years ago, when I was 11. I was at my best friend's house for a sleepover. My best friend, his older brother, and I, were all sitting around wondering what to do when the older brother suggested we go to the park, to which we happily agreed. Now something to know, this park wasn't actually a park at all, it was actually a small and dense patch of forest in the middle of the suburb where my best friend lived. So we all get ready and make the 5-minute walk down there. We are there for about half an hour when we decide to stop and take a break in the middle of the forest. As we were sitting there, we thought it would be fun to do the whistle from the Hunger Games. The movie had just come out, and we were all obsessed with it at the time. So we all started doing it until the brother told us to be quiet. At first we didn't know when, but then we heard it, a faint whistle back. The brother did it again and again. There was a reply, only this time it was closer, and it kept getting closer. We all froze, not sure of what to do until it seemed to stop. We all agreed it was time to go home at this point, and as we were about to come out of where we hid, I heard from a bush behind me, "Hey, come here." You can bet we took off running. As we were running, I swear I could hear someone running after us, so I turned my head back to look, and when I turned back, I ran first into a tree branch. I took a nasty fall, hitting my head. I don't really remember what happened after, but my friend and his brother must have carried me out because the next thing I remember was my best friend over me asking if I was okay, and we were in the field on the opposite end of where we entered. I had a black eye from the stick and a mild concussion from the fall. The boys were both covered in cuts and bruises from running through the woods. We have never been back there since. We are all adults now, my best friend 18, his brother 20, and I 19, and we still talk about it and speculate on who or what that could have been. I went outside for my close to 3 a.m. walk, haven't been on one in a while, but I felt uneasy and just wanted to stand still on the porch after I locked the door behind me. After unintentionally staring at the neighbor's house while standing in place for a moment, I began my walk, but I got mild anxiety for some reason and felt the need to check all the shaded places around me, basically everywhere. This caused me to walk back to my porch while saying aloud to myself, maybe I'll just stay on the porch. As I got to the middle of my front porch, I turned around and looked around. I breathed in the peacefully cold air and relaxed a bit right before the thing happened. I heard what sounded like a combination of a human yelping and a duck quacking, those higher pitched quacks that they do when they fly or if they're excited to be let out of a cage to be with their owner. It wasn't just in one spot, it was 2 different locations of the sound, one to my left and in the sky but close at the same time, slightly off from each other, and a third sound that came from the right, and it was way out of time from the other 2. While it sounded like this, it also seemed like it was everywhere or jumping around. The original description is where I mainly heard it. Knowing my stories of creatures that mimic animal stories and now panicking from this human/duck sound, I spun around quickly and scurried to unlock the door. I have a history of many paranormal events, but this one is one I don't yet understand. The woods are in biking distance, if you can bike 30 miles, and our small town is surrounded by farmland, but this stuff doesn't usually happen around neighborhoods, right? The Boogie Woods, a haunting tale from Dexter, Missouri. In the quiet town of Dexter, Missouri, there lies a stretch of land so sinister that even the bravest locals refuse to venture into it after dark. This foreboding forest, known as the Boogie Woods, spans about 1,000 acres and has been the source of chilling tales and spine-tingling encounters for generations. One such tale dates back to 1978, involving a young high school graduate named Linda Johnson. This is her story. Linda Johnson had just turned 18. It was the summer of 1978, and she was looking forward to starting a new chapter in her life. The warm, golden days were filled with plans for college, dreams of the future, and the simple pleasures of youth. Linda was the pride of her family, known for her bright smile and kind heart. But on one fateful evening, all those dreams were tragically shattered. On a crisp September night, Linda attended a party at a friend's house near the edge of town. The celebration was lively, filled with laughter and music. As the night wore on, Linda decided to head home, eager to beat her curfew. She waved goodbye to her friends, promising to call them the next day. But Linda never made it home. Her family reported her missing the following morning, and a frantic search ensued. Days turned into a week, and hope began to fade. Then, on a gloomy autumn afternoon, Linda's body was discovered in a cemetery behind an old, abandoned church at the edge of the Boogie Woods. She had been ended. The entire town was plunged into mourning, and whispers of a monstrous figure behind the heinous act began to circulate. William Dale Abel, a local farmhand who had once worked for Linda's great-grandmother, was arrested and charged with her murder. Abel, who was already known around town for his erratic behavior, soon became infamous as the Boogie Man. The trial revealed horrifying details, and Abel was convicted, forever cementing his name in Dexter's dark history. But Abel's capture did little to quell the eerie aura surrounding the Boogie Woods. For years, the forest had been a meeting spot for the Ku Klux Klan, adding layers of malevolence to its already sinister reputation. And long before Linda's tragic end, another dark tale was woven into the fabric of the woods' history. In the late 1800s, a woman was accused of witchcraft by the superstitious townsfolk. Fearful and enraged, they dragged her into the Boogie Woods and burned her at the stake. Her anguished cries were said to echo through the trees, and many believed her restless spirit still roamed the forest, seeking vengeance. The Boogie Woods also became known as a paranormal haven. Hunters and hikers alike reported seeing strange, dark creatures lurking among the trees. Some described ghostly apparitions, while others spoke of bizarre, unidentifiable animals that defied logic. Equipment would malfunction, strange lights would appear and disappear, and an overwhelming sense of dread would descend upon anyone who dared to venture too deep. Many hunters abandoned their tree stands, unwilling to retrieve them after encountering the forest's eerie inhabitants. One such account comes from Tom Riley, a seasoned hunter who had been stalking deer in the Boogie Woods for years. One autumn morning, as the mist curled around the ancient oaks, Tom spotted a deer in the distance. He raised his rifle, steadying his aim. But just as he was about to pull the trigger, he felt an icy breath on the back of his neck. He spun around, expecting to see another hunter, but there was no one there. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he glimpsed a shadowy figure darting between the trees. It was tall, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. Paralyzed with fear, Tom could only watch as it disappeared into the depths of the woods. He never hunted there again. These tales and many others have cemented the Boogie Woods as a place of fear and fascination in Dexter, Missouri. Whether it's the lingering presence of a vengeful spirit, the malevolent aura left by the KKK, or the terrifying legend of the Boogie Man, the forest holds its secrets close, shrouded in darkness and mystery. And while some dismiss the stories as mere folklore, others swear by their encounters, leaving the true nature of the Boogie Woods open to interpretation. For those brave enough to explore, the Boogie Woods stand as a chilling reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. This isn't so much a personal experience as something I wanted to bring to light and see what others have experienced in the same area. I'm an avid backpacker and biker, but I've yet to do it alone. And here's why. Searchers will resume combing the rugged Willamette National Forest after the snow leaves the higher elevations in weeks to come, looking for the remains of a 32-year-old Eugene hiker who disappeared last summer. James Jake Dutton, a 5'10", 180-pound Lane Community College graduate, left his 1998 Nissan Frontier pickup at a U.S. Forest Service trailhead near Cougar Reservoir on June 15, 2012. An unmarried former Coast Guardsman who stayed fit by hiking and riding bicycles, he carried a backpack and was believed heading toward the Three Sisters wilderness boundary. Dutton had plans to return to his truck on June 18, according to the trailhead pass he signed. He was never seen again. As Oregonians begin heading for the trails this summer, Dutton's disappearance a year ago is one reminder of the risks. A staggering 189 men and 51 women officially remain listed as missing since 1997 by the Oregon Office of Emergency Management after trekking into Oregon's wildest places, said Georges Kleinbaum, search and rescue coordinator for the office. It only takes a mile before you get totally turned around and don't know which way to go, said Kleinbaum, adding that 1,036 search and rescue missions were conducted across Oregon last year. While more than 89% of those sought by searchers are recovered alive, the consequences of getting lost can be dire. 8% die, and 2% are never found, said Kleinbaum. Often, we find hunters who had a map and compass with them, but we find them deceased in the woods, said Mary King, Emergency Services Coordinator for the Benton County Sheriff's Office. That's not rare. University of Oregon mathematics professor Da-Ming Xu failed to return after walking into the Willamette National Forest 9 miles east of Dutton's departure point in November 2007. Xu, in his 50s, was on a day hike carrying a water bottle and guidebook. He wore lightweight clothing despite the lofty 4,500-foot elevation and lateness of the season. Part of Xu's guidebook was found by another hiker in the French Peat Creek drainage 1.5 weeks after he was reported missing. Winter storms forced suspension of the search for him November 18 that year, and nothing more has been seen or heard of him. There is a mystery here, says Dutton's mother, Cynthia Boucher, 66, of Vancouver, Washington. Both Jake and the professor were experienced hikers on wilderness trails. Two grown men can't simply disappear from the mountains 5 years apart. Unfortunately, they can. More than 30 people have wandered into Lane County's mountains and never returned over the past 40 years, estimates John Miller, Search and Rescue Coordinator for the Lane County Sheriff's Office in Eugene. Oregon is still a pretty primitive state, he said. We have a lot of National Forest and U.S. Bureau of Land Management land. A lot of it is heavy second growth and old growth. That keeps us from bringing closure to the families when their loved ones go missing. Lane and Deschutes counties probably are the two likeliest places in Oregon to go missing, owing to spectacular scenery and lots of enthusiastic hikers and backpackers, says King. The parched forests and deserts of eastern Oregon make getting lost harder and searching less challenging than in the drippy, dense foliage of the Coast Range and Cascades. Still, people get lost everywhere in Oregon at one time or another, including the Pacific sand dunes and along the spectacular rim of Crater Lake during whiteouts and blizzards. More than 11 search and rescue operations were launched daily in America's national parks between 1992 and 2007, according to studies released in 2009 by the American Mathematical Society and the Online Journal of Wilderness and Environmental Medicine. The average cost of a search in the national parks was $895. Surviving in the backcountry after straying off a trail often is a matter of knowing how to read a map, compass, or GPS unit, and many who have those tools aren't proficient with them, said King, whose office in Benton County conducts about 20 searches a year. Many who fail to survive have poor fire building skills, are unable to keep warm and dry, and didn't bring extra food and water, she said. Jude McHugh, spokeswoman for the Willamette National Forest, said dense, coastal-type rain forest covers much of the terrain where she works, raising the odds that a hiker or backpacker might wander off an established trail. If that happens, the foliage can mask steep drop-offs and cause fatal falls, she said. People disappear for a variety of reasons, according to McHugh. Some probably go missing on purpose, some by accident, she said. Some go to a beautiful spot to take their own lives. Criminal activity also comes into play, said Miller, the Lane County Search Coordinator. People who make mistakes out there and are by themselves sometimes don't survive, he said. And sometimes they aren't found. There are not enough people in the world to put eyes on every bit of that ground out there. Kleinbaum's best advice for people planning a backcountry excursion is to prepare for the worst and let somebody know where they're going and when they plan to return. Those things make all the difference, he said. As for Dutton, the Eugene hiker who vanished in 2012, Lane County search teams plan training exercises in Willamette National Forest this summer. Possible encounters from a Michigan Nature Park worker. General info. I, female, 19, work in a position at a Michigan Nature Park that is not entirely dissimilar to that of a park ranger. My job duties usually include manning the entry booth and locking up the buildings at night. And although not a usual duty, sometimes they ask me to walk or take a parked vehicle through some of the trails. As I am on the younger side but still have several years of experience at the park, I'm a relatively experienced outdoorsman. I've had some odd things happen to me while on the job that I can't quite explain. I'm decently well versed in some areas of the paranormal, and although not entirely relevant, it's worth noting that I'm also a Norse pagan as part of a family belief and often wear protective symbols as well. And to be honest, I've started wearing them more since these odd things have been happening. I've tried looking into it myself, but overall I'm overwhelmed and not sure where to look, so a friend suggested I ask a forum like this about my experiences. I have 2 specific questions I would like to ask. Thing 1. I usually work the night shift, and this night in particular it was raining a lot and the conditions were getting unsafe. I was posted out in the booth, which is multiple miles from the office, so when things took a turn for the worse, my boss radioed me back. Some people who don't spend a lot of time in the woods don't realize how dark deep woods can get, much less in the dark at night. But I had both a flashlight and the light from the booth, which gave me probably 30 feet of visibility. And when I went to grab my stuff so I could lock up the booth and get to my car, I swear I saw something that moved very human-like but moved in a really odd way, like the only way I can describe it is if a horse-deer hybrid tried to run like a person. But there were no people out there, and it was most definitely not a deer. I'm probably not describing it in the best way, but it was very off. So I got to my car ASAP, and it didn't start right away, a bit odd but not entirely out of character for my car, but when I turned the key a second time, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, and it looked like whatever it was had gotten closer. The drive goes without incident, but I'm still off about what I saw, and when I get closer, I radio in to see if they need me to pick anyone up. And the radio doesn't work right, which was very out of character. These radios are designed to work in awful conditions, and I was the closest I'd been to any sort of signal in a while. I chalk it up to the weather and headed into the office. But as I do, something runs past me. I did not get a good look at what it was, but it was not a person, and I'm telling you there's not an animal in that woods that I know of that looks like either of the things I saw. I can't seem to shake the sensation. Thing 2. This happened more recently and is what prompted me to finally reach out to a forum of some kind. I was walking the trails for security purposes close to closing. We close around 11 p.m. and start a final walkthrough around 9 p.m. We do this to make sure no one's stuck on the trail or hurt, so they aren't stuck overnight when there's fewer staff and none that patrol those trails. So I was walking one of our trails, and I was pretty deep in the woods already, as I'm a fairly fast hiker, and this is a trail I know well. I was already about 2 miles into the trail when things started to get weird. I hear a noise off in the distance, and at first I thought it could be a coyote or an owl, so I pressed on. Coyotes stay off the trails, won't go after people unless they have dogs, and dogs are banned in the woods here, and they know when we do our sweeps, so I was not concerned. But then the noises got weirder. I'm used to the sounds of the woods, and I know the area and the wildlife very well, and I have never once in my life heard that sound before. It didn't come from any animal I recognize, and it most definitely was not human. I've never aborted a sweep before, even when I've had coyotes nearby, but it did not feel right, and I got out of there. We are allowed to use our judgment in these cases. If anyone has any idea what either of these things could be, please let me know. I really appreciate it. I'm an 18-year-old male from Nevada, and I was 17 when this happened. 2 of my friends and I, we will call them Star 16 female and Adriana 17 female, one day had a great idea to drive the 45-minute drive to go explore the Lovelock Cave. It's mid-August, and it's about 6 in the afternoon. When we came up with this idea, I was driving a 69 F100 at the time, and it had its issues. The starter was going out, my spark plugs were almost dead, and my timing was off. Given that it was pretty hard to start even when the engine was warm, let alone cold. Anyway, we decided to go to Lovelock. As we get to the base of the mountain, I crawl up the hill in the truck as far as I can because I'm the most athletic, lazy person to exist and don't want to walk as much as possible. I get the truck up almost to the entrance to the cave and park it. By this time the sun is setting and it's starting to get dark and cloudy. We get out of the truck and walk to the entrance of the cave. As we get to the entrance of the cave, we hear strange knocking coming from inside. We all just shake it off and keep going. We walk into the cave and start looking around for the supposed giant bones that were there when the cave was discovered. We keep going deeper and deeper into the cave and come across the mining platform. It's a platform made out of wood planks that was put there a long while ago. We then start hearing the knocking coming from closer to the entrance of the cave. We all look at each other in disbelief, and goosebumps start to rise to the top of my skin. By now, Star and Adriana are looking at me to see what my facial expression is giving about the sound. The knocking starts to turn into very quiet moan-like sounds. The girls ran over behind me as we tried to exit the cave. As we're trying to leave the cave, the moaning sounds get louder. We can't seem to see where the noises are coming from, even though my big flashlight is lighting up the entire cave entrance. We slowly creep to the entrance of the cave, and I shine my light around. I didn't see anything until I shined the light at my truck. I then see something so tall and deer-like standing on its hind legs. Its antlers are massive. Almost that of a moose. I don't think the girls see it at this point in time, so I shine my light away as quick as possible. I tell them to get down on their stomachs and crawl. We crawl out of the truck and stop. We then hear heavy footsteps coming towards us. I then yell at them to get up and start running. Follow my light, I yell as I start to get up and run. We all run up and down the mountain trying to lose whatever this is. We somehow make it back to my truck and get in and lock the doors. I fumble with the keys to try to get them in the ignition, but I can't seem to get it correct. After about 20 seconds of fumbling with my keys to get into the ignition, I finally get it. I turn the key, and the truck doesn't do anything. I know what I have to do, but that means I have to get out of the truck and tap the starter with the metal rod. I have sitting beside me in my seat. I roll my window down slightly and shine my light to see if I can see the thing that we saw. I didn't see it, so I deemed it safe to go out of the truck and tap the starter. I very silently opened my heavy metal door and stepped out of the truck and walked to the other side. I get down onto the dirt on the back side of the front passenger tire and push my metal rod between the frame and the fender wall. I then tap the starter a couple times and start to stand up. The girls start banging on the window, yelling and crying, pointing behind me. I don't even look behind me before I start running to the other side of the truck to get back in. I hear the thing behind me breathing heavily and staring me down. I hear it start to run very quickly as I'm approaching the other side of the truck. I open my door, jump in, and slam it closed. I lock the door as quickly as possible before the thing is banging up against the side of my door. It seems to have shifted figures, and it now looks like a decomposing human body. I turn the keys in the ignition, and the truck barely turns over. I let off the ignition and turn the key again, and the truck struggles as it comes to life with a roaring sputter of the engine. I turn my headlights on and try to back out of the spot it's in. The thing is still banging on my door as I start to move. I put the pedal to the floor, and the thing then acts as if a deer is in the headlights as my lights hit it. It freezes and looks at us with ferocious eyes. Scared, we all scream like little girls as I'm backing down the hill, and it starts to chase. I get down the hill to a point where I can turn around and pull off a movie scene. Turn flawlessly. I throw it in first and gun it with the thing still giving chase. I reach the peak of my RPMs and sling it in second gear. Burning out on the dirt, causing a huge dust cloud. The truck roars down the dirt road as we're all on the verge of tears. We get away from the dirt and onto the asphalt, as the thing is now losing us. I keep the throttle pinned to the floor and escape. Whatever that was. We get back home, and we all do research to figure out what we just saw. Now I'm not going to say it on this platform in fear that saying its name will cause it to show up again. Needless to say, we will never go back to those caves, especially in the dark. My friend's house is next to this forest. There is a long path to get there, and an electric fence is next. I went there with 4 of my friends. We had been there before during the daytime, and nothing really happened until today. Around 6 p.m., we walked in through the path until we reached the forest entrance. There was an electrical fence put up, which wasn't there the last time. However, it wasn't turned on, so we just went through it. Once we got in, we split up. 2 of them went ahead while me and my 2 friends went a different way. Once we went in, nothing really happened, except we heard a few weird noises and saw a cow in there. Until I saw 2 of my other friends running ahead out of the forest. I told the 2 guys I was with, and we decided to find out why they were running. As soon as we got out, they had already gone ahead. We kept walking until we noticed one of the guys who ran ahead of us was behind us. They said that they hadn't left the forest until they saw us leaving. We kept going ahead anyway, and it was getting really dark at this point. We were at this path next to the forest, trying to find another way in. Eventually we found an entrance and went in. We didn't go very far until I heard rustling noises deep into the forest. One of the guys walked in further and found a white blood bag and needles on the floor. As soon as we saw that, we decided that it was time to leave. About 6 years ago, I was in fantastic shape and used to take my then toddler on long day hikes in our local woods or state parks around Oregon. One Saturday we decided to do a 10-mile loop around a local reservoir. We packed a lunch so we could stop midpoint. I also always packed my kiddo a second set of clothes due to their proclivity for finding gross things. As usual, the toddler had a lot of energy at the beginning of the hike and would run 20 yards or so in front of me, stop to look at plants, help me identify things near the trail, and of course find a useful stick. After about 3 miles, the 4-year-old wanted to be carried for a bit. No biggie. Hoisted the tot up onto my shoulders, and off we went. We reached the half-mile point. The day was a beautiful April day in Oregon. We had encountered a small drizzle early on, but that just delighted the small one. Temperatures were such that a light flannel shirt was perfect, and I rolled up my sleeves after walking 2 miles with an extra 40 pounds on my shoulders. We ate lunch and continued on our way. About half a mile after eating, my 4-year-old's demeanor began to change. They became quiet and didn't want to run down the path or engage in looking at plants. I thought maybe they were just tired and our lunch break hadn't been long enough. However, we continued on. Soon I noticed that the ever-present sounds in the woods had stopped. It was eerily quiet, and all I could hear was the sound of our feet hitting the ground. The hair on the back of my neck started to prickle. I only had my hunting axe with me, so I found a heavy stick for myself. My 4-year-old asked if we could turn around. This kid doesn't like to turn around, especially on loop hikes. I didn't hesitate and said yes. I managed to fit them against my back and used my backpack to keep them in place, kind of like a Lillababy carrier. My head was on a swivel as I quickly walked back the way we came. After about a quarter mile, the feeling of unease and being watched receded. The typical sounds of birds, insects, frogs, and other creatures returned. A couple days later I saw on a local post that a logging crew who was on the opposite side of the hill we had hiked had spotted a mama mountain lion and her cub. No idea if that's what had me and my kiddo spooked, but it was definitely the most scared I'd ever felt on a hike. We went back a couple months after that and brought my husband with us. We did the whole loop and never encountered that feeling again. I have told this story to several friends, family, and coworkers. Partly to tell a weird experience I had in the forest and partly to see if I could get some insight into what I experienced. I am also interested in hearing from people listening to this what they think might have happened. I am originally from northwestern Ontario and have been in and out of the forest my whole life. I grew up hunting, fishing, camping, and have gone on many remote backcountry canoe trips. I've also worked in the forest for a few different jobs. I have always felt very comfortable in the forest and have never had a bad experience. That was until working in the forest near New Liskeard, Ontario. I was working as an ecologist in the district of North Bay, Ontario. As an ecologist, I had many different jobs that brought me to every end of the district. One of those jobs involved inventorying old logging cut blocks. This is something that I have done multiple times over multiple summers in different areas of the province. This particular block was located west of New Liskeard, about a 45-minute drive out of town. The area was very rural, with farm fields and the odd farmhouse scattered throughout. While driving the roads, it was common for other vehicles to stop and stare at you. This might have been because we were driving in a marked truck or that we were the only people that the locals didn't recognize. The block we were looking for hadn't been cut since 1995 and was located down this old, rarely used logging road. The two of us were tasked with collecting data on the block. To get to the block, we had to turn left onto this overgrown road that barely fit a truck. The road had many mud pits that nearly sank our truck at multiple locations. When we couldn't drive any further, we had to walk the rest of the way to the block, which took about a half hour. The work started the same as any other day. While we worked, we talked about office drama, funny experiences we have had, and what good movies we watched recently. As we got further into the block, I started to feel my chest get tighter. As we continued, I started feeling like we were being watched through the trees. These feelings got stronger the further we traveled into the logging block. I tried to shrug them off until my coworker suddenly stopped reciting the data we were collecting, looked at me, and said, "I have a terrible feeling about this place." We then discovered that we both had been feeling like we were being watched and that something wasn't right about this area of the forest. We continued our work with the unsettling feelings persisting. As we continued further into the cut block, keeping our conversation, we suddenly stopped dead in our tracks, dropping the last word that was uttered. We both heard what sounded like two people having a conversation. This we couldn't comprehend because we were in a remote area, deep down this almost undrivable trail on which we saw no sign of people. Then, another hour walk into the bush to get to our location in the cut block. The forest was too thick to be of any use recreationally, and it was not hunting season. What was also troubling was we couldn't make out what was being said. The voices would continue for a few seconds then disappear as quickly as they started. Once they stopped, we would continue our work but be stopped in our tracks as the incomprehensible voices would pick up a few minutes later. This pattern continued until we came across trees that had been bent over and snapped. Now it's not uncommon to find trees bent and snapped from bears, moose, and even the weather. But what was odd about these trees was their proximity to other trees. We would find a tight cluster of trees with the middle tree snapped and the others untouched. The trees were also free of any rub marks or scarring. Then, we came across a patch of young poplar trees that was completely surrounded by an almost perfect circle of dense spruce and pine trees. Within the patch, almost all of the poplar trees had been snapped and bent down in different directions, but the surrounding evergreens were untouched. Neither of us had ever seen anything like this before, and with the feeling that something was watching us, we quickly got out of the area. As we moved back out of the block, the voices stopped, and the feelings of dread and being watched drifted away. We both expressed that it felt normal again when we were only a half-hour walk away from where we had the experience. I have shown different foresters the photos looking for an explanation but never received a clear answer. The best I received was maybe the soil composition is different in that location, but all expressed how they have never seen trees broken like that. I have asked First Nation individuals from different communities and have been told by multiple people that what I experienced was a bad omen that shouldn't be talked about. Now that I typed that out, I am starting to have second thoughts about whether or not this is a good idea. What made me decide to share this on here was partly seeing others' weird experiences in the forest shared on here, but also learning that 2 women had disappeared from the New Liscard area. Julie Diane Fortier lived in Elk Lake, Ontario, upriver from the cut block I worked, and went missing in 1980 after taking the bus to school. 5 years to the day she disappeared, her school bag, running shoes, and coat were found near the Haileybury, Ontario, landfill. The landfill is located roughly 6 kilometers away from where she was supposed to be attending school and roughly 50 kilometers away from Elk Lake. Another 5 years pass before her remains are found by a couple along a dirt road outside of Haileybury. Many speculate on what happened to her, but the mystery was never solved. Melanie Ethier went missing from New Jersey in 1996 when she was on a 1-kilometer walk home from her friend's house. She was observed walking by multiple people on this 1-kilometer walk home and seen crossing the Armstrong Street Bridge near her house. The last stretch of her journey involved a poorly lit back road where she disappeared without a trace. To this day, Melanie's whereabouts are unknown. I am open to ideas on what I experienced in the forest of Northern Ontario. My job continues to involve me slogging through remote areas of Canada. To this day, I have never felt the way I did in the forest near New Liscard, Ontario. I'm from Northern California, and I have spent a lot of time backpacking and primitive camping in various parks throughout the region. I've never been a big fan of car camping simply because people are trouble and I aim to avoid them in nature. This incident further solidified my original feelings and has prevented me from doing any camping at more populated sites since. A couple years back, 2 of my girlfriends and I decided on a whim to head north and camp alongside the Yuba River. We had a decent day swimming and sunning ourselves on the rocks before we headed back to camp to cook dinner. All in all, a lovely day. We were all sleeping in separate tents, and I should mention that one of my friends is a heavy sleeper, and the other had a fair amount to drink and was out cold. Around 2 a.m., I woke suddenly. I was disoriented, and it took me a moment to realize the sounds I was hearing were those of a woman in distress. She was desperately pleading with someone. Her cries became hysterical screams, and it quickly became evident that she was being hurt. Without thinking, I exited my tent and attempted to wake my girlfriends. I was panicked and frightened, and my instinct was to avoid making too much noise. I was unable to stir either of them. I felt like I was virtually useless and would likely get myself injured or worse if I were to intervene, but I couldn't sit idly by while someone was being hurt. I grabbed my buck knife, and with the moon high over my head, I cautiously crept toward the commotion. As I faltered toward the clearing of their campsite, suddenly to my left I heard loud footsteps, and a man emerged from the woods. He gestured for me to keep quiet, and his confident and frankly pissed demeanor and gait put me instantly at ease. I could hear a kerfuffle, and shortly after the man emerged with the woman, a young boy, and 2 Chinese. She was overwrought and didn't want to be near the man who had come to her aid and insisted she only wanted to speak with me. She told me they were in between housing and that this was an isolated incident. The hurt had clearly been prolonged and frequent, considering she had old bruises and injuries all over her body. I recognize now that I could have handled what would be the remainder of the night in a smarter and safer way, but live and learn, I guess. There was no cell service, and she didn't want to leave the campground. I offered my tent to her and her son and slept in my truck. By the morning light, she was gone. I felt completely deflated and depressed. What was supposed to be a light-hearted getaway had turned heavy and bleak. I made coffee for my campmates, and we discussed the events of the night and decided we just wanted to go home. We packed up, and I thought to brush my teeth before hitting the road. I'm going to town when all of a sudden this absolute ghoul of a man begins trudging up the hill toward me. He's tall and scrawny, prematurely bald, and looks clammy as hell. He was screaming ducking pig, this ducking witch that, and it is readily apparent that this is the culprit from the previous evening. He begins frantically scanning the forest floor and picks up a large rock while honing it on me. Instead of feeling afraid now, I'm livid. I happen to be a DV survivor, and even if this weren't the case, this slimy piece of trash was threatening me. With toothpaste foaming at my mouth, I shout back that he's a coward, but I guess he thinks he's a big man because he's not afraid to hit a woman. I like to think I looked rabid. Long story short, another man burst through the trees and clotheslined the loser. So yeah, I'm not really afraid of wildlife. Just us humans. So I, female, 35, lived in a neighborhood growing up that had woods lining the entire back of it. My friends and I would ride our bikes through the trails but never went in too far. The reason we never went too far in was because it was rumored that there is a spot where people held devil worship ceremonies. Most people in the neighborhood have heard this rumor and stay away from the woods. If our parents knew we were riding in them, they'd certainly attempt to put a stop to it. One day at dusk, my friends and I dared each other to follow the one forbidden trail that entered the deep woods that were off limits. Being about 14, our brave little souls didn't think much of it. We rode a good mile and a half and saw nothing. We were about to turn around since it was getting pretty dark and we'd have to be home soon when we came upon a small clearing. What we saw and heard has stayed with us to this day. There was a flashlight sitting on a rock turned on. As if that wasn't creepy enough, when we followed the stream of light, it was shining on this shrine, I guess you can call it. It was made out of wood, hastily put together. On it were pictures of Satan. The pictures all had red stuff dried to it, which I can only imagine was dried blood. There were rocks and different crystals and dried up animal skins. Now realizing the truth that there were in fact ceremonies held there, we were about to get the hell out of there when we all stopped at the same time and looked at each other. My right hand up, this is the truth. We all heard it. It was low at first as we strained to listen, but we didn't have to strain for long. It got louder and louder. It was a whisper. It sounded like 20 people whispering. We couldn't make out what was being said. It sounded like a foreign language. We were frozen for a good minute or two listening to the whispering get louder and louder. There was no one else in the woods, as far as we could tell. There certainly wasn't anyone close enough for us to hear them whisper. After a minute or two, we all took off like bats out of hell. We rode as fast as we could until we were out of the woods and on the safety of the house street. We never went back into those woods again. We never realized what that whispering was. It was one of the creepiest things to ever happen to me. I have resided in West Virginia for my entire life. I don't come from a rich family, and I am not rich myself. I live in a small, single-wide trailer with my 2-year-old son outside of the town of Gary. My boyfriend is a truck driver and is only home every so often. I'm kind of used to being alone with my son here at night. My closest neighbor is 3 miles, and my trailer is back in the woods. This is a mountain town. I grew up hearing scary stories of monsters, but I never saw anything growing up. I never saw anything until now, and I want to tell you about it. I found your group by accident, but I think what you are talking about here is most definitely what is stalking us here, because I know it's not a Sasquatch. Well, I never saw a Sasquatch, but I think I would know if I ever saw one. So this just started last summer. I clean houses for a living, and I was leaving the last house of the day and had just gone to pick up my son from the babysitters, and we headed back home. It was 8 o'clock exactly when we turned in the driveway. My driveway is a very long sand driveway surrounded by trees and the woods on both sides. I hadn't even gotten to my house when I saw a man jump from one tree on the right side of the driveway to a tree on the left side of the driveway. I mean, like 30 feet in the air. He just jumped like a monkey swings from trees. He did this in front of the car as I was still driving slowly to get to the trailer. It's bumpy sand on the driveway, so I never go more than 10 miles per hour down it. At that moment I wasn't sure what I saw, but I did know it was a man. I saw its skin, and it had some torn cloth on him too. Arms. Legs. All of that a man would have. Did not see his face. I hit my brakes. My son is still in the back seat, almost asleep. I didn't question what I saw or try to make sense of it because I knew it was some creature. Yes, I was scared. My first thought was my son. I only stopped there in my driveway for a second, and then I went ahead and sped up to go on and get down the driveway so I could get in the house with my son. I'm passing those trees to my left, and I'm just looking around to see if it's there. I don't see anything. I just keep on going. It's about dark, but I can still see. I see my trailer around the corner up ahead, and I see movement. Okay, so let me add here that it isn't that uncommon for some deer or other animals to be around the trailer. That's normal. But there were people up ahead, and one of them was in my trash bag. I don't have trash service way out here, so I sometimes will sit a bag of trash on my porch and haul it myself to the dump. So a man was all in my trash. I get closer, and these people hear my car, and my headlights are lighting up the front area of my house. And I see like 4 of these things run off into the woods. I saw one of them real good. But it was his face that really got me scared. That thing had dirt or mud all over his face, and there was something wrong with his face because it didn't look right to me. His eyes were way up on his forehead, and it had this hump back. It had some dark pants on but no shirt, and the chest and back had a lot of brown hair. His nipples were huge and dark, and I could see it through the hair. He was bare feet. This was the one that dug in my trash bag. He ran off too, but he didn't seem to be in such a rush as the other ones were to get back in the woods. I lost sight of them all, and I waited before I went any farther because of my son. I didn't have a gun or anything on me. So I was careful. I sat in my car for 20 minutes running idle before I drove on up to the house. I grabbed my son, and we ran inside, and because there was no cell signal down my driveway, I called my uncle once I got inside. My uncle said I was seeing shit, but he came on out there an hour later and looked around. Lord, I was so scared while me and my son sat here waiting for my uncle. My uncle got here. He's a big guy and had weapons on him. He investigated. He came back in the front door white as a ghost. He came in and said he had seen the devil in those woods and that we were getting in his truck with my son and we're getting the hell out of here. We never called the police or anything. What were we going to tell the police? That was last summer. The winter came and nothing. Then just this past March, when my boyfriend was home, we heard scratching at 11 at night on the side of the trailer. A metallic sound. He went outside to look, but there wasn't anything there, but he smelled a smell that he described as rotten pig feet. If you eat pig feet, then you know what I mean. We smell bad things a lot, and we see things moving in the trees. But now my boyfriend will be moving us to another state because of his job, and we only have a few more weeks, but there are some wild clans in West Virginia. Not just in NC and TN, and no, my uncle never talked about it, no matter what he saw. My friends and I decided to go camping one spring break. We had planned a week in advance, and as the day got closer, the weather got worse. It was cold and gray, unheard of for Arkansas. The night finally came along with yet another cold front. It was in the 30s, but we had dressed warm and stocked up on whiskey and beer. The plan was to hit a spot my buddy knew, which was barely accessible with his 4x4. We wanted to really camp at none of those designated sites for families and seniors in RVs. So we aimed away from civilization, which was only made up of a single stoplight and a couple hundred people, and drove into the woods. After 30 minutes of bone-rattling dips across dry creek beds and detours around trees, it started to rain. By the time we found camp, it had turned into hail. An ancient dirt road, a few hundred feet long, and the rotting carcass of a VW bug marked the spot. That night was spent passing a bottle around, hoping we'd figure out the tents before we were too drunk. Eventually we did and managed to start a fire with diesel. At this point the hail had stopped, the empty whiskey bottle lay broken in the fire, and we had a decent pile of empties growing. We drank, we played cards, and we passed out in our tents. The next morning I gradually regained consciousness to the sound of something large being dragged past my tent. It was what looked to have once been a station wagon, stripped and rust-covered, dragging the VW with a chain. The VW had been there for so long that the floor had rotted out and roots had tied it to the forest floor. They lay scattered in the wake of the wagon. A woman was driving, a man beside her, and 3 shirtless kids sat in the back where there used to be seats. The man stared out the window away from us the entire time. The children had dirt smeared on their faces, which lit up their glassy 1,000-yard stares. It's the look of crushing poverty, and you've probably only seen it in pictures. It exists in war-torn countries, with projects in inner cities and the deep south. So deep that the old gas station back in town, a place you'd probably jokingly hum the Deliverance theme, was the city to these people. She spoke in a deep nicotine and whiskey-soaked drawl. Y'all come from the city to do some camping? Well, I think that's fine as long as you're not using drugs. Y'all ain't doing drugs, are you? We weren't. Just drinking, then? Hell, I like a drink now and again, my darn self, that's fine, that's just fine. Wanna know how I knew y'all were here? Seen them flying around? Them some boys that work for me, see, this is my land, and they told me. Can't be too careful, figured. I'd better check it out. She started laughing. Mucus bubbled up to wet her dry cackle, the man stared out at nothing, and one of the children put both hands on the window and gazed through us. His mouth hung open and spit cut a line through the filth on the glass. He was probably 10 years old. Do y'all know Bethany? We didn't. Ha! Everyone knows about old Beth. Y'all go to church? I lied. Good, I don't have time for those that don't fear God. Why don't you come to church tomorrow? You can meet Bethany. It's just over that hill up there, I can't miss it. Boy, she'd sure like to meet y'all. They all would. We assured her we would. She drove away into the trees, slowly dragging the VW. As soon as she left, we all looked at each other and started laughing. It was just nerves, there wasn't anything amusing about it. We all have the remnants of a primitive warning system for danger. It's been eroded by living safe and civilized, but every once in a while it goes off and you obey it without a question. Something is wrong. The problem began even before she spoke, as I gazed into her eyes. Something is wrong. The kids, the man, her laugh. Something is wrong. Eventually, we hiked up the hill. The view stretched for a mile. There was nothing. No buildings, no clearings, just forest. We cut our trip short, packed up, and left before noon. I am Ben, and I want to share this very strange and creepy story. All of this began around June 24, 2022. This story takes place in Raleigh County, West Virginia. I go to my uncle's house every summer. We do some crazy and fun stuff. On June 24th, we decided to go up this old logging road across from his property. It goes way up into deep mountains and woods. It was around 6 p.m., mid-daylight. We were going up there to explore, shoot guns, and check out the area. When we got way into this logging road, we came to a roundabout of gravel driveways. One goes deeper into the mountain, the other goes into a big clearing. We went into the clearing because my uncle usually goes up there and he knows the area. So, we got to the clearing and got our guns out and started shooting at a popkin we had sitting out for a target. This was a pretty big opening. It was like a huge circle of just dried up mud and lang, and then all around you is dark, dense forest. After we got done shooting, it was almost sunset, so we were about to head back. As we got into the truck, something caught our attention on the tree line, so we walked over to see what it was. We were familiar with animals such as black bears, panthers, and mountain lions all around, so it wasn't anything abnormal. As you walk into the forest, there is a creek that stretches all through the mountain and down back to his property. We were checking out the creek, and we spotted this huge blue pipe has been placed neatly across the creek. It wasn't in the ground, and there was no area where it was pulled out. We thought it was kind of weird, so we just called it off. We walked a little way, and as we walked, we heard a loud noise against that pipe. It echoed throughout the woods. It sounded like a baseball bat hitting a pipe or a big rock. We turned around and pulled out guns, and there was nothing to be seen. We continued walking for about another minute until we heard footsteps behind us. We turned around, nothing again. We thought we were being followed by a panther or mountain lion, so we just decided to leave. We headed off the logging road and went back to his property. Later that night around 11 p.m. we decided to go outside again and have a fire since we just got back from the creek. Before we lit the fire, we decided to go a bit into the forest to see if we could find any more firewood to make the fire burn a little bit longer. It was pitch black, we had flashlights, and it was strangely quiet in the area. Usually there are crickets, owls, and frogs everywhere. But this certain night, it was completely silent. As we walked in, my uncle's brother Jeff also came with us. Jeff spotted red eyes sitting in the tree, about 40 feet up, staring directly down at us. We shined our light on it, and whatever it was, it immediately spread its huge wings, about 10 feet in wingspan, and jumped to another tree. We could not see it all. This spooked us so much. We continued to walk but scanned the trees as we did so. We spotted it again about 7 trees over from its old location. We shined light at it again, and it flew up into the air at the speed of light. Whatever it was huge because leaves and branches snapped off and flew everywhere like twigs when this thing jumped out of it. We got spooked, so we ran out of the woods, went into his yard where it's open, and spotted it again sitting in another tree. We zoomed into it with the rifle, and it was gone again, but this time we didn't see it move, so we had no clue where it was. At this point, we were hearing noises all around us. We went inside since it was getting late, and this thing was following us. The next summer. This took place around July 7, 2023. This was the same woods area where we saw this thing last summer. We assumed it was gone since it's been a whole summer. We walked out, and immediately we noticed the dreadful quietness again. We were going out to see if we could explore the woods a little more. We heard the scariest noise I can ever imagine, and I still remember it plain as day. It was this ape-like sound. It sounded like a human, but a gorilla just screams exactly like a monkey, and then we heard something sprinting through the woods at an extremely fast speed, tearing down branches and trees in its path. We couldn't see it due to there being a small hill in front of us, and whatever it was coming from behind the hill in the deep forest. As that one let out that horrifying scream, another, different scream came from a different direction. As we were walking out, something had thrown a ton of rocks and boulders at us, causing us to run out. This is West Virginia. Keep in mind it's like midnight and there's no monkeys in West Virginia. July 9, 2023. My uncle had texted me and asked me if I would like to go explore that logging road again, but at night and walking. So, of course, I said yes. As we were walking in, he warned me that his brother Jeff had seen something so scary up here that he dropped his stuff so he could run faster, and he was scared to death. We don't know what he saw, he would never tell us. But I said let's go in, and we went in anyway. The thing that he apparently saw was on this very creepy, overgrown hill that you see right as you get on the logging road. It's like a cleared out path through the middle of the woods. The first thing we noticed was the sound of footsteps on this hill. We shined lights but never saw anything. We continued going deeper. We hit about the mile mark. On the right side of the path, it's a straight 30-foot drop to the creek. On the left is a huge rock mountain, so there's nowhere to run but the path. On the right of us was the sound of rocks hitting the creek like something was following us. We had a clear view of the creek, but every time we heard a noise, we shined lights immediately and saw nothing. It was so strange, whatever it was clearly able to not be seen. All we heard the entire way back was the noises of something following us that we couldn't see. We got to about the roundabout where the clearing was. We heard this very strange sound. It was like a human mocking the sound of a cow saying moo, but in a ghostly, joking voice. It was not my uncle because he was beside me and it was coming from the woods in front of us. This sound I can still remember happening plain as day, and it gives me the chills. Every time we heard it, it sounded like it was getting closer. That noise scared us, so we turned around to leave. As we turned around, we heard branches snapping in the area we had just come from. Something was stalking us. As we were headed back, we heard footsteps on the path all along behind us the entire way back. On some occasions, you can hear the footsteps full on sprinting at us. Stuff fell from trees right in front of us, but nothing happened. We kept seeing red eyes. The scariest part that happened was that my uncle was walking next to me. We were about halfway back. Suddenly, his backpack unbuckles and flies off his back, and I saw it. It got yanked backwards and flew 20 feet. As this happened, I just poked by something in the dark behind me. I turned around and saw nothing. A couple seconds later, I got touched again. Nothing there. We heard footsteps again, we turned around, and we saw this huge creature, with a spade hat kind of, black mist all around it, 10 feet tall, red eyes, and smelled horrible. It looked like it had a huge cape on it. It disappeared in midair in front of us, so we continued walking faster and got out of there. After this, nothing happened since. We are planning to go back out that logging road with more people and catch it on film to get proof of all of this. In Deep Say, Texas, these swampy woods are the thickest bush I've ever seen. In high school, I was very unpopular. I used to spend almost all of my free time in the woods and swamps behind my house. The woods and swamps stretched for many miles. I hunted rabbits and squirrels and would occasionally fish, but there was nothing in the water but grendel/bowfin. They grew huge and put up a fight like nothing else sometimes. There were deer, but they were impossible to hunt, and there were pigs, but I encountered them once. I set this up so you know that I was very familiar with these woods. I'd even spotlight sometimes. I vibed very well in there, and it was my home away from home. One day, seemingly random, I got a very off-putting malevolent vibe from those same woods, very dark and hostile. I'm giving myself goosebumps as I type this. I haven't thought about this in decades. The woods did not want me in there, it felt like. I don't know how long this went on for, I can't remember, but I absolutely did not go near until that went away. I get the impression that it was several months. Obviously I went back out in there, and it was like nothing happened. Several years later I decided for several reasons to get hypnotized to recall curious events, that specifically being one. I'm not sure if I trust what was done or how, as I now realize that some of the questions were a little leading. What I do recall specifically is that on one of the very well-worn main trails, I walked up to 3 owls in the middle of the trail. They were 3 to 4 feet tall. The eyes were large. They were gray. I damn well know 3 to 4 foot owls do not stand in the middle of a main trail in the middle of the day waiting for you, but that is what I remembered from the sessions. The details, I'm not sure if I believe them. That's where the leading questions came in. It's not important that you believe or not. This happened. The parts that I don't trust I'm not going to speak to because my memories may have been corrupted. I don't want to make things worse. This all happened in the mid-80s. I don't remember much beyond that. Thank you for getting this far. One 4th of July weekend in 2011, a buddy of mine that I'll refer to as Todd, ended up in a pretty precarious situation. What follows is the story as he told it to me. It was supposed to be a fun weekend up the hill and in the woods at Todd's friend Troy's cabin. Troy was to introduce Todd to a girl he had also invited over, so naturally, Todd was looking forward to some devious fun for the holiday weekend. As luck had it, Todd and his new date clicked and soon found themselves downstairs for some alone time fun. Shortly after Todd and his date disappeared downstairs, Troy decided to go out for a little while. A little while later, as Todd and his date were getting into it, Troy returned to his cabin with some company. Upon hearing foreign voices upstairs, Todd went up there to see who was there. To Todd's dismay, he found that Troy had brought home someone that he disliked. A guy named Ace for the sake of this story. Seeing Ace, Todd got angry, and an argument ensued between Todd and Troy, while poor Ace stood awkwardly near the doorway. Cue Troy's girlfriend entering only to stand next to Ace with a bewildered expression on her face. Todd had rushed upstairs in his boxers at first, thinking that it was just guys that had arrived initially, so he and Troy quickly went downstairs to argue further. As Todd and Troy's argument diminished, Troy decided that he, his girlfriend, and Ace would go swimming at a nearby creek for a while to cool off. For whatever reason, Troy threw on Todd's shorts to swim in, which had Todd's keys, wallet, and cigarettes in the pockets. Troy and his company had already been gone for a few minutes before Todd realized what had happened. So, Todd and his date continued on downstairs until Troy, Ace, and Troy's girlfriend returned to the cabin. Right as Todd heard them returning though, he went upstairs to confront Troy, fuming. Todd demanded his shorts back while yelling about his stuff in the pockets during Troy's swim. As the two argued back and forth for a while, Troy's girlfriend, Todd's date, and Ace tried to pretty much blend with the wallpaper. As Todd demanded that Troy take his shorts off then and there, Troy informed him that he would not be stripping down in front of everyone. That was when Ace cut in to have Troy's back, making the argument even worse. But Ace knew that Todd had quite a reputation for fighting and not losing, so in order to sort of prove himself to Troy, he jumped right into that argument. After a little more arguing, Troy and his girlfriend left again in Todd's shorts. Ace stayed behind though, for some reason, maybe because Troy had left without his backpack full of his personal and important items. Eventually, Todd and his date went back downstairs to go back at it. Ace, of course, stayed upstairs and kept company with Todd's pit bull. They all expected Troy and his girlfriend to return that night, at least with his backpack. But, when everyone woke up the next morning, they realized that Troy and his girlfriend had not returned to the cabin. Everyone was puzzled as to what Troy was up to, but since Troy had left his cell phone in his backpack, they all just hung around the cabin and waited for Troy. The second night came and went with no word from Troy or his girlfriend. It wasn't until they got up on the third day with still no Troy that they finally really started to worry. Alarm bells were definitely going off for the trio. Todd decided to try and call Troy's girlfriend again, like he had the previous day when her phone seemed to be switched off. That day it finally rang, and she picked it up. Fear crept into her voice when she realized that Troy wasn't back at the cabin like she assumed he would have been. So, she and Todd agreed to start calling around to see if they could track down Troy. However, no one had heard from Troy at all. Next, a panicking Todd called a few friends up to the isolated cabin to help search the nearby woods for Troy. There was not a single trace of Troy. It was Todd who made the decision to call Troy's girlfriend and have her report Troy missing. She did just that, but when asked of Troy's last known whereabouts, she gave them the honest answer. She told them that Troy was last seen at his cabin having a heated argument with Todd. The problem with that was that Todd had a pretty well-known reputation for fighting and not generally losing. At this point in which the following events took place, Troy had been missing for 3 days, so he was declared lost at that point. Apparently, the cops decided they should take it seriously. The following morning, Todd, his date, and Ace were fast asleep, only to be startled awake to the sounds of both the front door being kicked in and people running around on the roof. The SWAT team flooded in, subduing the trio inside. At one point, one of the SWAT officers said, "I will shoot you, and I will shoot that thing." Upon hearing that, Ace suddenly popped his face up from the floor and exclaimed, "Why are you going to shoot the dog? Don't shoot the dog." Of course, the dog did not get hurt at all. What came next was the trio getting questioned by a couple of detectives portraying in the usual good cop, bad cop scenario. Unfortunately for Todd though, he was the last person seen with Troy, and they were arguing. Couple that with Todd's reputation for fighting, and well, that made Todd the number one and only suspect in Troy's disappearance. It also didn't help that the detectives had found some clothing left by the hot tub, and some of the clothing had drops of blood on it, though Todd insisted that he didn't even know whose clothes they were. Search and rescue came in next to comb the surrounding woods for clues to Troy's whereabouts. They searched for hours while Todd, Ace, and Todd's date were still being questioned, but they focused mainly on Todd. After a couple of hours of interrogation, Todd finally got irritated and insisted that since Troy had been missing for 3 days at that point, he could either be dead or alive, but they should be focusing their efforts on finding Troy. Oblivious to Todd and company was the fact that search and rescue had located Troy, deep in the woods and hours away from his cabin. Troy was found passed out on a large rock, naked and just hours away from his demise. The next thing that Todd, his date, Ace, and the detectives heard was the sound of the search and rescue helicopter's chopper blades cutting through the air and getting closer to the cabin. As they peered out the door, they saw the approaching chopper with Troy suspended in a blue diaper-like thing from it. The chopper was looking for a safe place to lower Troy enough for emergency ground personnel to be able to reach him. As the smoke was still clearing on the whole situation a couple of days later, Todd was informed about the facts that led up to Troy's disappearance. Apparently, Troy and his girlfriend left the cabin on the night he vanished to simply cool off after the argument with a nice walk in the woods that surrounded the cabin. But, right before they left for that walk, Troy's girlfriend had stolen his debit card. Shortly after setting out on their walk, Troy and his girlfriend got into an argument themselves. They got separated after that, and Troy's girlfriend ended up walking herself back to the main road, where she'd called a ride, leaving Troy in the woods and assuming he'd find his way back to the cabin. So basically, Troy's girlfriend turned her phone off for the next couple days in order to avoid Troy's angry phone calls about his debit card while she partied the whole time. When she did finally turn her phone back on, she received Todd's concerned call about Troy. She was shocked to learn that Troy had been missing for the last couple of days. Troy ended up being relatively okay, considering his circumstances. Todd ended up moving out of state shortly after, which pretty much dissolved the friendship. As far as Ace, Todd's date, and Troy's girlfriend, well, they're in the wind, I guess you could say. I'm almost positive, though, that none of the people involved in this story will ever be able to forget the events that took place over those fateful 3 days at that cabin. The Forest Path. This is a true story described as it happened to me on the 3rd of April 2016 in Staffordshire, UK. Me and X set out at around midnight to find the smoke spot tree in this dark forest path. The path is surrounded by inaccessible masses of dead plants and smaller pathways to dingier litter-filled areas. It has a small, filthy stream running alongside it, quite spooky. The first occurrence was that a snake was heard, hissing and rustling in the brush. We fell totally silent and into hunter mode as we inched forward deeper into the trees, listening and watching and walking one behind the other, only to occasionally stop and listen. The birds were following us too. They flapped off of the trees when we approached and landed on the tree further down. They were watching us all the way through. The fear was really setting in at this point. I wanted to turn back, but I kept going. He started to talk about watching out for homeless people, animals, and ghosts. The further we got in, the more he mentioned ghosts. We started hearing a sheep baaing, and after a few iterations, X said that it was in fact the noise that the ghost makes in forests, people who had come here and ended themselves and still inhabited the trees. He said they usually come out at 1 to 3 a.m., so when we looked at his phone, it was 5 minutes to 1. The terror really set in when the shadows started moving quickly from the phone light X was casting around to spot the snake. To our astonishment, we both saw 2 glowing green eyes, clear as day, in the bushes ahead of us. I thought it was a cat or the sheep, but he said no, and we walked on in silence. I was checking our rear now, trying not to make any noise. My feet were sinking into the wet mud. Occasionally we would stop and crouch, watching out and listening for the forest dwellers. We were headed for a giant old tree that looked like it was going to fall down. We sat on its mossy, damp surface and started to smoke some green. This, of course, made the whole thing far more surreal. But I wasn't paranoid. I didn't have any fear because I knew that ghosts weren't real. I'd been here many times late at night and alone too. So we were having fun, chatting about the ghost and where he could have died. X pointed to some eerie places and said that this must be where someone died because of the large growth of tangly dead branches, like plants had just exploded from where someone was buried, using the dead person's energy to create a new body for his soul to inhabit. X started talking about possession and the fact that the ghost could possess me if I didn't stay alert. X knew that I was the weaker-willed of the two of us and was more susceptible to invasion from an entity. He said I could lose control of my body and eventually lose my will and replace the ghost in the trees forever. The ghost would inhabit my body, and he would have to restrain me. He's more muscular, taller, and has a stronger ego than me. In my head, I went through these sentences. Ghosts aren't real and come on, possess me, I don't care, it'll be fun and actually, I deny you access to my body, and I made a shield symbol in my mind. This last sentence revealed my true fear that ghosts might actually be real. I was now paranoid that the ghost had been dared to possess me and that I also believed they were real. We continued through the forest to the other side, where there was an opening leading out of the forest to a street. So we decided to turn back and go back through the forest path, to my discomfort now, but I kind of wanted to go on the adventure. We were really lit at this point, so I was feeling adventurous and mysterious. Going back seemed like a crazy idea, and I was half on board and half genuinely fearful. Through the walking back, I led the way forward. X was asking me if he'd freaked me out, but I was confidently marching and silently watching without much assumption that anything would happen. My confidence revealed my weakness. I felt alone, listening to X's footsteps and staring into shadow after shadow. But I was totally unassuming still, rooted in my rationality. I wasn't afraid of a ghost. I stopped in my tracks and turned my head with a malevolent grin on my face to freak out to get him back for telling me all these ghost stories. This is shortly before X started leading the way again and I started to lose control over my right leg. It was at this point that I started focusing intensely on my right leg. I couldn't tell if it was me controlling it or not. The leg was being yanked forward and my right arm with it. I was making a spastic jolting motion with the right side of my body as I skipped merrily forward. My upper body was limp, and my left side was being dragged along by the right. It was as if I was being pulled upwards and forwards by my right arm. But during the minute or so this was happening, I could only focus on my right leg and laugh hysterically. I started saying, "I can't control my leg. I can't control my leg." All the while laughing with X. He and I both thought I was joking. I couldn't stop though. I was cackling and saying, "You think this is funny and all, but I actually can't stop." I was trying to get X's attention with what little consciousness I had, trying to progress into his line of sight. It was dark and muddy, and all I could do was march spastically while staring down at my right leg. X started asking in disbelief if I was serious over and over again. We were still laughing it off. Our rationality couldn't place any of this in our system of beliefs. So up until I was released, we still thought I was joking. The release was a violent spin with both my arms outstretched. I twirled around and forward with the momentum from being pulled quickly forward and released. We were both staring at each other, and I started panicking with my hands on my knees. I still hadn't cognized what had happened to me, so I kept walking at a normal pace for a while, slowly speeding up to get out of the forest. Me and X exchanged our incredulous laughter and admitted some genuine fear at what had just happened. I had actually lost control of my body, and we were still in the forest, waiting for it to happen again. We had to escape, so we picked up the pace, eventually running through the opening onto a roadside. I was now yelling, "What the duck, dude?" into the night sky. I was briefly even more scared by this stupid, ducking buzzing electric bus stop timetable. We knew we had to get back to the confines of X's room, but we didn't know if we had successfully escaped the ghost. Back in X's room, we sort of went a bit nuts. Together, we created a plan to exorcise me naked in the shower with the Bible included in our kitchen. But I had lost the key to my room and was viciously destroying X's bead spread to try and find it. The dread overwhelmed us. We had to go back to the forest. We had to backtrack to find my key. The only way to avoid paying the locksmith was to go back to that place. After some brief insanity involving X's roommate, he only humored me so far, but I was actually acting like there were ghosts, and I freaked him out a bit. We set out to get the key at 3 a.m. by the forest path. On this day, an unbelievable turn of events saved us from returning to that place. Another resident told me that he saw the key on the floor by the entrance of the forest path. With some looking, we found it and returned to our room. The atmosphere, or atmosphere if you will, had not left us after we left the forest for good. We were disturbed and paranoid about our thoughts and objects in his room. I felt like I was being talked to or that there was some presence trying to get at me. It was probably just my thoughts creating the reality, but nonetheless, I couldn't bear to be alone or even in a different seat than X. Then, as I was talking, X's laptop screen turned on its own, and we freaked. The worst thing is that there was a letter typed in the password field on the computer. We were utterly convinced that ghosts are real, and I think we still are to this hour. We continued to watch some ghost documentaries, and they didn't seem so ridiculous anymore. Instead of watching it with skeptical condescension, we were actually on the edge of our seats at some of the unexplainable things that had happened. Because that's what happened to us, something totally explainable. I had been possessed and drawn deeper into the forest by some outside force. We started to put it all together now: the snake, the birds, the eyes, the frogs, the sheep sound, and the way I had acted towards the ghost. I had to go and get some blankets and a pillow and sleep on his floor. I simply could not return to my own room. The floor was hard as duck, but I made do. I was still decently high as well. So feel free to explain this away as a drug-induced fantasy because my subconscious sure is going to. I don't know if I can change my beliefs based on a drug-driven ghost encounter. However, there is always the possibility that it will happen. Was real. That ghosts are real, and they can possess your body. I used to live on the outskirts of a tiny town, nestled in a forest. There were about 4 other houses on the dirt road I lived on, and woods surrounded us for miles. I remember once when I was about 5 years old playing out back behind the house when I heard movement behind me. I turned around to find a mountain lion staring me down from about 15 feet away. I ran back inside, looking back only a couple times, and she was thankfully rather uninterested in me because she didn't chase, just watched. I spotted her a few more times after that from my bedroom window at the edge of the trees, just watching. In the same house, when I was around 12 years old, I would stay up all night on the computer in chat rooms and playing games. I had a frequent visitor at my window. This absolutely massive owl would hang out on the deck for hours and just hoot. On a slightly darker note, when you live in the woods, there is always noise at night. Choruses of frogs and crickets and birds. I loved falling asleep to their sounds. The nights that I couldn't sleep were the nights that it was dead silent. Something always felt unnatural, and I always felt like I was being watched when it was quiet like that. I made it a point to never go outside for fresh air on nights like those. Don't trust quiet woods. This is a true story, as I was present for these events. I have to say that had this not happened to me, I would have a difficult time believing the story. To this day, I cannot tell this story or go into deep thought about the events of that day without becoming somewhat shaken. It was the fall of 1984 in the upstate NY town of Scotchtown, which is a fairly rural part of the state. The cool weather hadn't yet set in, and it was still warm enough that my two friends, Brian and Mike, wanted to go camping. We were all 16 years old, and I had never been camping, and I was excited about the trip. That week after school we had gone to an Army/Navy store and bought a surplus Army tent, some pots and pans. Brian bought a lantern, and both of them had bought old military K-bar knives. We set our overnight camping trip for that Friday after school. We had each told our parents we were staying at each other's house to avoid any problems the trip may cause with our parents. Friday after school, we all rode the bus to Mike's house, where we had stashed all our camping gear for the trip. We gathered all the gear and set out walking down a road that led farther into the rural part of the county. We had made this trek many times during the day and explored the wooded areas fairly extensively during daylight and knew the area we were headed pretty well. We walked about an hour into the countryside before cutting down a dirt road that led to a trail we had been on many times during our daytime explorations. However, we had never been out in these woods at night. We made it to the trail opening around 5 p.m. and ventured into the forest. This trail is marked by an old stone wall. These walls are very common in the area and were used as property dividers when the area was first settled, early 1700s. This trail followed right alongside the wall for many miles, and we were never able to find the point where the two separated. As we walked into the woods, the wall was now on our left. The area we were traveling was a combination of dense patches of trees and vegetation and many areas that were more open with scattered trees. It was in these more open areas that we often came across stone foundations of homes that used to stand there and an occasional headstone where early settlers had buried loved ones on their own property. We walked for about an hour, and because the canopy of trees was very thick, it was starting to get dark, still light out but dimming, so we thought it best to stop before dark. We came upon a clearing to our right that had a fairly large tree in it, and we would camp directly under the tree. To give an accurate idea of exactly what our campsite looked like, standing in our campsite, if you looked toward the trail, it would be the trail, then the stone wall. On the other side of the wall directly opposite our campsite was a very large oak tree about 4 feet in diameter standing alone and a few scattered trees behind it, but a fairly open area. The oak tree was less than 20 feet from our campsite, and I had a clear line of sight to both the tree and the field behind it. As it was starting to get dark, Mike and Brian wanted to go grab some wood for a campfire and asked me to start to set up the tent. They wandered out of sight to my left. I was facing trail, and I could hear them rummaging for firewood. I proceeded to dump the contents out of the canvas tent bag onto the ground, bent over, and started gathering the tent poles. My next action changed my life forever. I glanced up towards the oak tree on the other side of the wall. What I saw still haunts me today, a solid black figure peering at me from behind the oak tree on the other side of the stone wall. I could best describe it as a shadow, solid black, and non-translucent. I could see its entire upper torso as it leaned out from behind the tree, and I could see a shadowed out hand on the front of the tree as if it were pulling itself out from behind it. I was absolutely frozen with fear. I can honestly say that was the one and only time I was actually frozen from fear. I stared at it for what seemed like an eternity. However, I believe it was about 5 to 10 seconds. I didn't see this out of the corner of my eye, I was staring directly at it. Just then it slid back behind the tree, and I instantly heard Mike and Brian coming up behind me. I jumped up and yelled, guys, get over here." They came running and asked what the matter was. I thought for a second and was embarrassed to tell them what I had seen. I said, "There's someone behind that tree, I just saw someone behind that tree." They both looked at me with a bit of a puzzled look, and Brian replied, What are you talking about? We're in the middle of nowhere." I emphatically told them I had seen someone looking at me from behind the tree. We had been friends for many years, and they knew I was not one to scare or get rattled easily. Mike then said, "All right, we charge the tree. Dave, you go right, and we'll go left." They pulled their K-bar knives out of the sheaths they had on their belts, and I grabbed my pair of nunchaku. I was very much into martial arts at the time and had become very proficient with them as a weapon. We all three charged towards the trail, jumped the wall, and ran around the oak tree and nothing. There was nothing there. There was no way anyone could have gotten away from there without us seeing them. The tree stood alone, the ground was covered with leaves, and still there was nothing. They laughed and joked, blaming this on first camping trip jitters, and I was now even more shaken. I knew what I had seen, and I had never been so scared in my whole life, but the night was just getting started, and all I wanted to do was go home. Night fell, and as they went about their camping rituals, starting the fire and getting out a pack of ground beef we had swiped from Mike's freezer to cook over the fire, I sat on a log quietly terrified, still trying to process what I had seen. We were there about 3 hours when we first heard something in the woods. There was something walking around our campsite just beyond the light of the campfire, maybe 20 to 25 feet in the darkness behind where Mike and Brian were sitting. I was the first to ask, guys, what is that?" Brian answered, "Probably just a deer." I replied, "It doesn't sound like a deer, it sounds like a person. It didn't sound like an animal, it sounded like someone walking in the woods, and they weren't trying to be quiet." They both insisted it was probably an animal attracted to the smell of food. I said nothing. I knew in my heart it wasn't an animal, still keeping the secret of what I had truly seen. As the night wore on and the animal continued to walk back and forth behind our campsite, I could see it was beginning to bother both Brian and Mike. Brian stood up with his lantern and took a short run towards the rustling and yelled "ah," in an obvious attempt to scare off whatever was harassing us. He sat back down again, and within a few minutes later the sound of crunching leaves and snapping twigs resumed. The harassment continued for another 30 minutes or so, and Mike and Brian were now eerily quiet and visibly getting shaken, back and forth. It walked just beyond our view, crunch, crunch, snap, crunch. It was about 10 minutes later, and all of us were now sitting quietly trying to act as if nothing was wrong when Brian suddenly jumped up. He grabbed a piece of the wood he had collected. It was about 14 inches long and thicker than an average man's forearm. He threw the wood directly at the noise in the dark. We heard it hit the ground. Brian sat back down again and confidently said, "That'll scare it away." For a few short minutes it was quiet, then just as before we heard the walking and leaves started up again. This time it sounded as if it only took a few steps and stopped. We all sat there quietly, not knowing what to say, when all of a sudden we heard a whoosh as something cut through the air. The piece of wood Brian had thrown earlier came sailing over my head and hit the tree I was sitting under with a glancing blow and fell about 10 feet from me. I looked at Mike and Brian, who were as white as ghosts, and I asked, "Do deer go through logs? I told you I saw something, and you didn't believe me." They sat there for probably less than a minute, and the noise again had started back up. Brian finally spoke up and said, "We can stay here all night, and I won't get a wink of sleep or." Mike jumped in. "Let's get the duck out of here now." They jumped up, and Mike asked me to start to kick dirt on the fire as Brian lit his lantern. Mike and Brian then proceeded to break down the tent, which actually amounted to them ripping it down and rolling it up in a ball. They quickly stuffed the poles and canvas back into the bag as I finished putting out the fire. We paid no mind to whether the noise continued. We were solely focused on getting the hell out of there. There we stood, all packed up and not looking forward to the long hike out in total darkness. Brian decided he would take the lead as he had the lantern, Mike would be second in line, and I would bring up the rear. Both Mike and Brian drew their knives, and Mike looked at me and said, "Dave, anything comes out of the dark, you crack it with those chucks." I slowly nodded, and we began to walk out. The wall was now on our right as we began to make our way through the darkness. The lantern did not provide much light, and Mike and I were in almost complete darkness just following the light in front of us. At first there was a foot or two between each of us, and we had been walking for about 15 minutes when I thought I heard something. The trail was fairly worn and had only a few leaves on it. I thought I heard walking in the leaves on the other side of the stone wall in the darkness. I grabbed Mike's belt and he grabbed Brian's. All three of us stopped and we huddled. They asked what was wrong. I whispered, "I think I hear it right there," and looked to my right, indicating the darkness just on the other side of the wall. We stood motionless, all of us listening, and nothing. Mike said, "Listen, we're all freaked out. Let's just get out of here." Brian and I both nodded, and we again started to walk out. Again, we walked another 10 minutes, and I heard it again. This time I didn't stop. I leaned forward and whispered into Mike's ear, "Listen." We slowed our pace for just a few seconds when Mike said, "Oh duck, I hear it." There was something walking parallel to us on the other side of the wall. It was unmistakable. It was there walking in the leaves, and it was only about 5 feet from us in the darkness. It was right there. Mike grabbed Brian, and we all huddled again, and we both told him, "It's right there," and looked into the darkness over the wall. We stood still for a second, and then all three of us heard something moving among the leaves. It was almost difficult to hear because my heart was pounding so hard that I thought it might explode out of my chest. I was experiencing pure terror. Brian took his lantern and extended his arm over the wall, his knife in his other hand at the ready. We could now see about 10 feet on the other side of the wall. All three of us stood there for a few seconds looking, and we could see nothing. Then we heard it again moving in the leaves on the ground. The sound was right there but nothing. We couldn't see a thing. Brian said, "Let's just get out of here." We still had about 40 minutes of walking ahead of us, so we started walking again. The noise immediately started again. It was keeping pace with us, and it was obvious it wanted us to know it was there. Brian stopped suddenly and said, "Let's run as fast as we can for 30 seconds and stop and see what happens." We agreed, and off we went, running as fast as our teenage legs would carry us. We stopped out of breath and we listened, then we heard it. Stomping in the leaves in the darkness on the other side of the wall, it was chasing us. We huddled together, ignoring the noise it was making not more than a few feet from us in the dark. It sounded almost like pacing. Mike spoke first, asking, "What are we going to do?" Just then a sinking thought came to mind, and I spoke up, "No one knows we are out here. We lied to everyone. They'll never find us." They both stared at me with blank expressions as the realization of how screwed we really were sunk in. Brian said, "Listen, in 10 seconds, I'm running the whole way out of here. If you can keep up, great. If not, I hope I see you tomorrow." With that, Brian was gone, and the only thing visible was the bouncing lantern moving through the forest. Mike and I followed best we could. Mike was carrying the tent bag, and it was spilling its contents on the trail as we frantically tried to keep up with Brian. If we lost him, we'd be stuck in the woods with no source of light. I was tripping over the tent poles and the canvas tent but never lost my footing. We ran the entire way out, and when we reached the road, we all began throwing up. We snuck back into Mike's basement, and that's where we slept. Those two went back the next day to collect everything we dropped on the trail. I declined to go with them. They actually went back the following weekend prepared with tripwires, flashlights, and machetes. I guess to prove something. I never did, even though I grew up traipsing around those woods. Since then I have not spent a night in the woods and have no plans to ever venture into a forest again. I never told them what I really saw, but I know what I saw, and nothing will ever change that fact. This story takes place in August of 2013, in the mountains of southern Oregon. I am a USAF Security Forces airman, military policeman. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick, another military cop, and I decided to go explore some back roads and get out of the heat in town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used and many totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I spent many of our days off starting on roads that we knew, finding roads we didn't know, driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over the mountains, we set off on a road we had never been on and began the drive into the mountains. After driving for around an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of other people in the woods. We rounded a bend in the thick fir woods and emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noise, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. The table was very odd, however. It was painted a bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as aspens grow extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5 feet 5 inches. Regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to even sit on them. As I was looking at the table, Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of color that was completely out of place in the thick trees. A small one-man tent was set back in the trees, about 50 feet from the strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread and felt certain that there was someone in the tent, and if we could see the tent, they could see us. There were no campgrounds in this area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone camping so remotely would be, at the very least, a strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we didn't see any movement or hear any sounds coming from it. Nick suggested I call out. I didn't want to, but I did. "Hey! Anyone in there?" I yelled. No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving this strange area. But we began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in the tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it all the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. Should we need to leave in a hurry, he would be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees towards the tent. I was totally keyed up with my senses on full alert. When I reached the campsite, several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over. Nobody had built a fire or collected any wood. The tent was literally full of backpacks and women's clothing. Full of dread, I turned to leave and tell Nick what I had seen. As I left, I heard Nick start yelling. "Let's go. Let's get the duck out of here." Knowing why he was yelling, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt into the passenger seat, and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men, a third person was laying against the window in the back. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and accelerated the way we had come from. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified that they would catch up, we hit the highway without seeing the car again. I still do not know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police, and they promised to send a trooper out to check out the scene. However, I received a call the next day from a trooper stating that the campsite, the backpacks, and the women's clothing were all gone, though he could tell people had been in the area. The strange table was still in the thick aspen grove. I have not returned to the area and do not intend to. When I was in high school, I played on the basketball team and ran track. To keep my cardio up, I used to run this 11-kilometer hiking trail that went through the hills right outside of my town. It was a small town, it was safe for the most part, and everybody knew each other. I wouldn't call this trail remote, because at certain points you'd pass a dog park and train tracks, and one stretch of it ran alongside the highway. But some parts were pretty deep into the woods. There was an option to complete a 4 kilometers loop within this 11 kilometers trail, and people frequently used this route. I rarely encountered anyone on the longer trail. I ran this same trail for 3 years, and nothing strange ever happened, until this one day. It started off as it normally did. I parked my car on the dirt road that came off of the highway and smoked a joint while queuing songs on my phone. I put my earphones in, popped a piece of gum in my mouth, and began walking toward the trail. The only thing I took with me on my runs were my phone, earphones, and a single car key wrapped around my index finger. I don't recall seeing anybody on the trail that day. It was in the afternoon, and it wasn't abnormal for the trail to be less busy than it would have been during the evening. I walked for a few minutes while I was still on the crushed stone path. Once you got a little ways into the trail, it turned pretty rugged. Dirt and mud, with large tree roots reaching across it in all directions. I liked this trail because I had to focus on where my feet were landing with every step, so I was less focused on how much energy I was exerting. I was about halfway through the 11-kilometer loop, and this was really the most remote part of it. It was all forest, and there were a lot of hills and dips in the path and big boulders all around you. I didn't see or hear anything odd, but out of nowhere, I had this extreme sense of dread come over me. I kept running, I didn't really react. Once I reached a more flat part of the trail just a few feet ahead, I took my earphones out while keeping the same running pace. I noticed it was eerily silent, but I didn't experience a moment where I acknowledged that meant there's likely some sort of predator in the area. The only predators that would have been around me for wildlife would be a coyote, maybe a bear, but this would be very unlikely as there are never bear sightings anywhere near the town. I slowed my jog to a walk because the trail got steep and I had to walk over knee-high rocks, but I was still moving fast because I felt like something was behind me. For some reason, this next part is very hard to remember. Just this slice of about 30 seconds feels almost like I'm trying to recall a dream that I had, but I saw something out in the trees. When I try to remember, I can't fully picture it, almost like looking at a blurry image. It wasn't an animal, it was a person. I can't explain it, but I could clearly sense that it was a male. I pretended not to see the figure in the trees. I remember doing this so they wouldn't know that I was aware of them. It felt subconscious, automatic, and 100% instinctive. The figure wasn't behind me in the way that it felt when I first sensed a presence. It was in front of me, but on the side, my 2 o'clock to be exact. It didn't move as I walked by, the person just stood there completely still and watched me pass. Once I got up around the turn, probably 15 feet ahead, I ran so freaking fast it was like my feet were going to detach from my body. I remember how weak my knees felt in this sprint, but adrenaline was carrying me out of there at a speed that was faster than I've ever moved in my life. I didn't hear footsteps, but it felt like they were right behind me. As if I would feel two hands reach out and grab me at any moment. Primal fear. I didn't stop running until I was out of the trees and could see my car. This may feel anticlimactic, but nothing happened, and when I looked back after leaving the trees, there was nobody there. My adrenaline was flooding the entire time, but the deep sense of dread left a couple of minutes after it arrived. I just knew I couldn't stop running until I was out. I think somebody was coming after me because they saw a 5-foot, young girl with long blonde hair running alone in the woods. Maybe they were waiting for somebody to pass by, but I have a gut feeling that they were out there for some other reason, and I happened to walk by at the wrong time. I know it may seem like I just smoked a joint, went into the woods alone, and wigged out. But I'd been smoking weed every day for about 5 years at this point, not proud of how young I was when I started lol, and I did this every single time before I went for a run on that trail. 4 times a week for 3 years. Nothing like this ever happened to me before or after this run. Although I did switch trails after 2 or 3 more visits. I didn't feel the sense of dread that I felt that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it might happen again. Sometimes I wonder if something would have happened to me if I kept running there. I don't live there anymore, I haven't for a while, and I haven't heard of anything bad happening there. But someone was in the woods that day, and they did not have good intentions when they saw me walk by them standing in the trees. Has anybody else ever been out in the woods and experienced this sense of dread without seeing or hearing danger? I'd love to read any similar experiences. We all know about the primal instincts that we carry with us as humans, how we can feel a set of eyes on us long before ours are ever on them. What do you think? Was there somebody out in the woods that day, or did I just spook myself until I ran out of the woods like an idiot? This happened almost 3 years ago. During the pandemic, I was sort of lost and extremely bored without human interaction. This was until me and my buddies found mountain biking when our parents allowed us to see each other outside. Living in Washington State, there are lots of woods perfect for MTB, mountain bike, trails. Being under the age of 16 at the time, we had no license to drive to any actual mountain bike parks, so instead we built them. Apart from the one trail already near our house with a 30-foot gap jump, which was way above our skill level, we wanted to make something new. Basically, there is an entrance to this trail near my friend's house, and you walk down it a ways until you find the normal trail. To get to our trail, you find this one spot on the trail that turns 90 degrees to the left, but instead go to the right off the trail, through all this mud, weave between these fallen trees and tree branches, and from there you go right where it sort of curls around until it goes straight again. From there, you go straight through this small pathway, which is still hidden from all the ferns, until you reach this abandoned forest road. Now you follow the forest road down, which goes for around 80 yards or so. It is also covered in a huge amount of mud, and if you were there, you would see all the clumps with our footprints going about 6 or so inches deep and even deeper in some spots. There are more fallen trees on this forest road, but if you continue to make your way down until it sort of stops, and then go off to the right and walk around this hidden pathway that weaves and curls all around this huge area of ferns for maybe another 60 or so yards, you finally reach the bottom of the trail we made. It probably takes about 10 minutes to get there, but around 5 on a good day where it isn't wet, like during the summer. Essentially, you have no reason to be there unless you're either lost, which is almost impossible to do unless you purposely wander off trail or are looking for it. On this particular day, my buddies couldn't go out to help build, so I decided to bring my younger siblings along. The only reason I felt scared going alone was around a week earlier, when me and one of my friends thought we found a cougar den with some scot nearby in a few spots. I also just didn't want to be alone that far out. My sister decided to come with, but my brother, I guess, had a friend who he was going to hang out with. Anyway, me and my sister ride our bikes there, carry them through the hidden area, and throw them off into some fern bushes right before you get to the forest road. From there, we went to the trail. The main reason I was out there was to be sure no trees had fallen because we had some extreme winds the days prior, and so we knew if we needed to bring some bigger saws to cut them. There wasn't any damage, but around a week later, a tree did end up blocking the end of the trail. Ironically, it is also important that I mention it was a rainy day. We were there for around 10 minutes while I showed my sister the trail. All of a sudden I get this call from my mom telling me my brother was asking where we were since he was going to come find me. I guess he had a change of plans or something, but me being lazy, I told my sister to go walk back down and wait outside the trail entrance in the neighborhood to wait for him. This would also give me the opportunity to do some work. I called her every few minutes or so since my brother should have arrived but he didn't. About 10 minutes go by, so she has been waiting for 20 minutes, when my mom called me again, telling me he had returned and couldn't find us. At this point I was kind of annoyed but called my sister, telling her to come back and to make sure nobody was around or following her for when she entered the trail so as not to give our spot away. I was waiting from anywhere between 7 and 10 minutes when I was wondering what was taking her so long, so when I walked over to the end of the forest road and I saw her walking all the way on the other side, I was relieved. She wasn't waking on the forest road yet, but she was perpendicular to it, walking towards it. From this angle, the bushes go from anywhere between hip and shoulder height, and so I could see her upper body with her hood on. This is when I realized that I didn't remember her wearing a white sweatshirt/windbreaker. Once the person turned the corner, I could tell it indeed was not her and was likely a grown man. I quickly backpedaled off to the side and down the hill a little bit behind a tree so I could call my sister. I was wondering where she was and if she got lost because, after all, it was hard to get to. I also didn't want this person to steal our bikes, and oh, did I forget to mention my bike was over $2,000? Don't worry, I made it worth it for how much I ended up riding it. It is also going to last a lifetime if properly maintained. With my worries about my bike in mind, I called my sister, and the second I heard the first ring, I heard a voice on the other side of the tree I was hiding behind say, "What are you doing?" It was my sister. I quickly told her to get down so as not to be seen by the person. I didn't want them to find the trail we were building, as I didn't want to get in any sort of trouble, and I wanted to keep it hidden. I also wanted to get back to the bikes. She could tell by the panic in my voice I was serious, and when I told her there was a person and she looked, she said no, there isn't. I peeked over, and sure enough, nobody was there. I knew what I saw though, and so we made our way back, walking past where I saw the person. I was worried the bikes would be gone, so as we trekked through the mud and my heart was pumping, I couldn't help the feeling of being watched. I could feel the adrenaline rush, and I almost knew they were off in the trees watching us. I was so distracted thinking they were going after the bikes when I saw them disappear that I didn't even think they would be hiding. Thankfully, as we made our way last and down the trail while acting as calmly as possible, we arrived to see the bikes, which were still indeed there. At one point it did look like there was a different shoe print because it was slightly larger and differently shaped, but it was hard to tell in this area. Now we made our way all the way back, while I constantly looked behind me, making sure we weren't being followed. Towards the end, where the trail splits off and leads to the neighborhood, there is a short but wide wooden bridge that is covered in dirt. Thankfully, since it was raining and you can easily see footprints, I could see the extra pair. You could vividly see my first set of footprints to get to the trail as well as my sister's, with an additional set of her footprints going back and then returning, and then a shoe print on top of hers showing it was most recent. This confirmed my sighting. My heart dropped once again, and we quickly got out of there, still making sure nobody else was behind us. When I got home, I didn't hesitate to tell my parents, who only told me that next time I needed to be with her at all costs. I could tell they partly didn't believe me or thought I was over-exaggerating. All these questions went through my head. On one side, we live in a nice neighborhood, and even if it was a random person who didn't live there, why were they there? If they were maybe worried about why a random little girl was wandering off into the trails, why did they even bother following, and when they did, why so far behind and so creepily? Why not call out? If it was a worker, why were they wearing what they were wearing? Wouldn't there have been boot prints? Be wearing a vest or helmet? A truck parked outside the trail? Wouldn't they have something else with them? Why hide? If they thought she was alone originally and they walked past two bikes, why did they keep going? It wasn't until they must have seen her taking to me or just saw me when they hid. Why did I feel like I was being watched when I was under the assumption the person was off stealing my bike and not even near us anymore? Why are the footprints entering but no going back? Why is someone hiking in an area like this in that attire? How did they even find the area by themselves? They definitely found it because of my sister, and when they did, why follow? When they saw how difficult it was to navigate, why keep going? Why feel the need to hide from two younger kids? Most importantly, what would have happened if I wasn't there? Anyway, I feel the need to explain some details. The footprints were maybe half an inch to an inch bigger than my shoes. My shoes were smaller at the time since they were beaters, but regardless, my guess is this person was anywhere from 2 inches shorter than me to 2 inches taller. I couldn't see their faces, but they were definitely white or had lighter skin. I'm going to be honest and tell you that the person wasn't this huge massive being to make it sound scary, but they definitely didn't fill out their sweatshirt or coat so they weren't super scary looking, but certainly much bigger than me at the time. At this point in time, I believe I was around 5 feet 8 and 130 pounds, which was pretty small at the time. It's also important to note that maybe they were innocent. However, I still always wonder what would have happened if I wasn't there.